first of all, I just want to welcome you all here. Cali College does have the expectation that we wear masks while we are in the building. So there are masks on the table for you. And so we'd appreciate you doing that. There's coffee and water in the back of the room, and then we'll have lunch served about 11:15. On your tables, you have the slides from a few of our presenters and then also the agenda for the day. And we're going to record today, and I'll send the recording out to everyone who registered at the end of the day. And then I can also forward the slides to everyone as well. If you have questions and you're joining us virtually, do feel free to text those into the chat box, and we'll be sure to ask those of our presenters as we go. And with that, we'll get started, and I'm going to turn it over to Stu.
10 minutes early.
Maybe if I can get his slides up.
Okay. See, I haven't done this like this. Kelsey, I'm okay taking this long here. Okay. Oh, you got a pointer there.
Yes.
Okay. I'm still serious.
So you should be good to go.
Well, they're kind of slow like me in the morning.
There you go.
Okay, you can travel now. I got the laser. We're ready to go. So if I hit you in the eye, guys, it's a pleasure to see most of you down here. We kind of had a little bit of a joke. I tease my banker every time I go in right now, and that if I did carry, I still have a mask on. So what but regardless, it's a pleasure to be here. How many of you guys have not grown cotton before, or excuse me, sorghum? Roger, Tom, you got me going on the wrong foot already. Forgot where I was at. Well, I got to thinking on the way down here, it's probably been several years since we had much sorghum down in Cali County, isn't it? So I know it was kind of fading, and we got into the corn pretty heavily down here, and I saw this year. I don't cover Cali County anymore, except for when I get to come in and be invited, which I appreciate. Kelsey, I appreciate what you do. I get her newsletter and try to help her out when I can from up north, but it just sometimes kind of hard. Now, this isn't Cali County, but you guys had great sorghum like this. This was in Reno County when I was still based over Hutchinson, and Edmund had some pretty good sorghum, and the basis differential north was about 70-80 cents a bushel right now with sorghum over corn. And my agent out in Cali County, Saline, not even Saline County anymore, it's Central Kansas District, Jay is seeing a huge influx in sorghum potential there. Sorghum was always kind of the back of the end of it wasn't sexy. It was like raising pigs were when I was a younger man. That paid the mortgage, but you could wear your cowboy hat if you had a few cows on the place too. And sorghum was like that too. We paid a lot of bills with sorghum, and we had a tough time making cornmeal. Things changed a lot over time. Some of you have been around maybe a little longer than I have been. But it was always an opportunity. We can raise good sorghum. You guys have a pretty good climate for it. Probably your biggest issue is just like it is across the rest of the state, the rainfall patterns. But it fits into a dryland pattern. I think in 2011 and 12, that was the most recent one we had that was pretty ugly to get us along. But you got your timer on me, don't you? But you didn't get me start 10 minutes. That was really gracious. Why should I take half an hour when I can say it in 2 or 3? So I'll try not to do that. One of the things that I looked at, what we're doing is it's still a hybrid selection. You're gonna hear that whether well, you're gonna hear whether it's variety or hybrid selection. That's still one of the biggest decisions you're gonna make, where you're gonna put your money. And one of the issues I've seen, those are your two closest replicated university trials. And, you know, there's problems with everything, but that's a good basis to go off of. I think it's about 80, is it 80 miles to Oklahoma from here, cross country? Something like that. It's between 80 and 100, and it's 80 or 100 to Hutchinson too, where that field is. But you don't really have anything east of here much anymore. But that can give you an indication. And that's what I've always told people when they are looking at whether it's a cotton variety, a corn hybrid, a sorghum hybrid, a soybean variety, is get as much information as you can, even if you've been growing it for a while. If you've been growing these crops recently, you've got a feel for what works well on your place. If you're trying some different things, and who knows how long a hybrid is going to last anymore. It's like a Rolodex. He doesn't remember what one was, Kelsey. You probably never saw one either, but it's kind of like your phone file and the contacts. Just scrolling through that, there are local trials that are out there. So just, you know, get as much information as you can. What's going to fit here? Look at the local demos and trials, but compare environments. That's one thing I was able to do in the past was use St. John, Hutchinson, Heston, and then shoot on over to Parsons. And I pretty much had that whole southern part covered. And I'd swing up to Belleville and grab theirs at that time too. Oftentimes you would see the changes, especially as you went north, but as you went from west to east as well, because you've got a pretty good area down here, and you probably switch 2 inches of rainfall from Wellington to Winfield at about 2 to 4 inch rainfall differential as a general rule over the years. It's just clockwork all the way across the state like that. Run your own tests if you need to. Well, I think one of the big things you're going to want to look for is its ability to avoid lodging. And a lodging score is still going to depend on when you hit that hot, dry spell in summer. So, you know that, but get something that'll do as well as you can, that has a pretty consistent match. And look all over the place. And when I used to do that, I look for planting dates when they've had their tests up. Your lodging scores are generally they're going to show up the most varied when it's a later planting. Get into that June double crop, because the largest yields we ever had at Hutch were about a June 20th to 22nd planting date. The greatest lodging scores came if you planted after Father's Day or somewhere in that neighborhood and further into the double cropping period, just because of the stress that would go on there. So, but that's something. Plant height, of course, and the ability to have head exertion. We've had a hybrid, a recent one, that was a very good yielder, but man, if it got a little bit dry when it was starting to shoot that head, it had enough trouble getting the head out of the boot. And it still fell, but you ran a lot of dry matter through your combine that you weren't going to be harvesting. It made for more dust, more trash, and a bigger pain, but it yielded well enough that if it rained normally, it would get that head shoved out and you didn't have to worry about that as much. But well, you check those hybrids for that head exertion and that type of thing. Planting time, we have a very wide window. Those of you that planted before know you can plant in less than about 6 weeks. You can probably start planting sorghum, or even 5 down here. You get soil warm enough normally, but you can also plant it all the way to July down here too. And I think that gives you some comfort, but it also can cause you some angst. But spread out those planting dates, because I don't know which one's the best. But if you're going to plant a crop, the best time to plant it is when you can plant it. You know, you want to shoot for early, generally, or I would. Get it, but check the cold tolerance. I'm not sure exactly what that means. You're still trying to define it. So Ignacio, I'm setting the table for him later. I'm getting all the questions for him, even though he's remote. Go after him. When we plant early, it's going to give that plant more time to make a factory to get it to heading. It's just like planting a corn hybrid early. It's going to flower later. This is going to head later and flower a little bit later. But you got more time to have that factory to push and build the carbohydrate load that's gonna go up into your grain, which is what you wanna harvest anyway. But you gotta have a good factory to bank that. It can shorten the grain filling period, but it's gonna lengthen the time from emergence to maturity. That kind of sounds conflicting, but things will move a little more rapidly. Probably should have this first, and it's my colleague that wrote down here with me, Dr. Lancaster, is going to talk about weed control. If you're planting early, that's more of a challenge with sorting. Unless you're planting narrow rows, which leads to other problems, or can. Does anybody here still have nested headers or that pick up the technical? Okay, so I would say a little bit about narrow rows. If you can do it, it's great, but you got to be able to harvest it too. And have something that'll pick it up if it falls down. What you can is go into stress a little earlier. What did I do? Missed that? Talking. Oh, whoa, back up. Woo. Okay, yeah, row spacing. Will any of you be planting in order of rows, 20s, 15s? Okay. Yield potentials are usually a little higher there. You're going to want to kick your seed rate up a little bit too. I've planted soybeans like that down through here too, and what I found is when it really gets hot and dry, your plants will die a little quicker in a narrow row because they're competing more in that topsoil. The interesting thing about sorghum as we look at it is it has a huge amount of its root capacity is in that top foot of soil. Compared to corn and even the beans, it's much higher on sorghum. Your machinery capabilities. Can you plant those narrow rows? If you're planting, if you've got a drill that does have singulation, it's better than the controlled spills that we used to have with the drill, but it's still not quite perfect if there is such a thing. Your planter units, I know we can get really good with them, and there may be some 15s down here or even 20s. And I know you can harvest 20s with your combine. It's got to be able to get it harvested too. Doesn't do any good laying out there unless you've got a lot of cows you can run across to clean it up. On your higher yielding fields, and Yachty will talk much more about this, kicking the population up a little bit, you have the potential for higher yields. But again, remember that high seed drop does not necessarily mean you're going to have a higher population than you could produce that with any crop you've ever planted. They can aid in weed management, a narrow row. A good canopy in a narrow row can aid in weed management. The best herbicide we still have is dark. And you don't have to buy that. You can pay to get it, but dark is outside of Bayer or BASF's window of ability to control. What is an effective minimum temperature? This is an old slide. You guys are going to see some older stuff here, but I do have some Cowley County things I want to show you a little bit later, just for fun. But, you know, I've got sorghum in at 58. And if you're trying to get sorghum out of the ground, it's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to be that color when it's coming out of the ground. I just sprayed some herbicide with some brome grass the last 2 days. And clouds and rainfall and temperature, it was frosted. It was 29, 30 degrees when I left this morning. Thinking, great, what did I do this time? But it had to get on. And sorghum will look sickly. It's Randy's shirt's color. That's what color it will be. And you know that. Every time you do something sorghum, turn that sickly A&M burgundy. With my apologies to A&M graduate over there. But she doesn't talk like that or act like that either. She's still acceptable. But sorghum and soybeans and cotton are all pretty close to what they can stand and whether they will grow well or not. And you know it's going to take a long time to get them out of the ground at that 60 degrees. 70-degree soil temperatures at 2 to 4 inches. And your nearest site, Randy, you guys, is it Hayesville for you guys? As closest to
there was one at Blackwell in Oklahoma.
Okay. Well, we were across the border, but it was. Okay. But, you know, and you can use your own thermometer out there too, but, you know, if you're going to get a soil temperature reading, you're looking at the mesonet sites or some of those sites. Well, I look at it at 10 to 2. That's usually not till after 10 o'clock or you're going to have it warmed up if it's going to be sunny out anyway. But you'd like to be at that warm at 2 to 4 inches. And they should have that kind of a reading on it. But we can't put it in the ground then. You see that one of the things that that we have here is we also have sunflower, whether that's domestic or wild, that you want to kill it, but that's one of our first weeds up. Pigweeds will even come up pretty early, earlier than I thought they would, if it's warm enough. And I know you don't have those. The reason I didn't throw this in here, this is one of my favorite slides of all time, done by an old Oklahoma State graduate named Lloyd Stone, that worked at K-State for years. What all this is talking is about is that would give you a maximum water use for a year if everything was perfect and things were going right. The threshold, this right here says it takes about 7 inches, and this is stored soil moisture plus your precipitation. So what you've got out there in that soil to begin with, it takes almost 7 inches to get grain sorghum to the point where it will produce its first bushel of grain per acre. That's all that's saying. And that for every inch after that 7 inches, you're probably going to add about 9 bushel on. That's what that slide is talking about. Kelsey, I didn't ask you, am I supposed to be speaking into the mic or is it picking me up?
You're close to the podium, it'll pick you up.
Okay, that a little dip there.
Yep, but don't fall over the.
Don't fall over the camera. Can I kick it?
Well, it's not-
Can I did.
There you go.
Okay, didn't mean to. It happens, you're dealing with an Aggie, an old one too. But, ideally, you'd get 12 bushels back for that next inch of water, but it's about 9.5. So that's about what you'll run. Now, you can have a full season of moisture. We did that at Belleville one year, but it was all in the silo because 13.5 of it came in the 19th August, something like that. So if we were ahead for the summer and had nothing to harvest, that's probably 2002, if I remember right. If you look at this again, you put that same thing to everything else you've got there. Lloyd, I did not get him to get cotton in this. I believe they've got something from down at Bushland, Texas you can find, or Brian Arnold has that kind of information at Oklahoma State. Brian, the bearded one. I give him a bad time. He's a good guy. I'm supposed to point this at something and hit it. Okay. Soil type. My friends in Osage County that I grew up with want to raise 100 bushel soybeans. There's probably about 5 acres in the whole county that's capable of doing that. I say, I tell my high school buddies, well, sell this quarter and go buy 40 acres somewhere else that's decent ground. Because that's the way my farm is. I think 60 is the highest we ever hit, and it rained also, that was 2010. But, and this is this is the hybrid maturity down here. That's the middle. That's a late, early, middle, and late. That's some real scientific categories. How do I get that off there? It doesn't really bother me. Does it bother you?
Doesn't bother me, but you might want to see what's on the bottom of this.
Well,
Bothers Randy. We'll get it off.
but Randy talks slow.
Can't read it.
Well, I got you. I understand it.
I can't read.
Well, I've shared a screen before, and it's an ugly thing, so it's your computer, so I'm gonna let you, whoa, use the hammer.
Is that
Okay,
better?
you ought to be good. See, nothing to hide, don't look behind the screw of the curtain, there's nobody there, but anyway, but that's relative, whether it's an early, medium, or late. And you'll see sorghums like that, because they can be early, or they can be medium, or they can be late, and they may be at least 2 of the 3, as you know what I mean, but that's like with the planting date, you will add about 2 more leaves on, just like you will with a corn hybrid. If you plant, the earlier you plant it, you're probably going to get 2 more leaves on the darn plant. And sorghum's the same way, because early ones will shut off earlier. And that's how our station manager Hutch used to control, or Heston used to control the bird damage, as he planted a short, early maturing variety that the birds and all the hedgerows around there fed on that and left these variety plots alone. And then they went somewhere else, and that's how he had to battle that issue. But you don't have as much yield potential when you're an early maturing hybrid out there normally. Under normal circumstances with good rainfall the full year. The mediums fit very well for us, and a good producing soil, if you're in a poor poor soil area, your earlies may be your best. It's going to keep it from going into that stress at the wrong time. And the capabilities of it is high, but the potential in on some of the poor ground is better. So it's just a matter of thinking things through. Those principles haven't changed in at least 40 years that I know of. Okay. It is the arrow, isn't it, Kelsey? Did I kill the battery? Did you kill it? I'll tell you what. I don't know
That's
how
why
to
we
do
had to start early.
it. Hey. Sure. I hit Harris. How about page down? No? Yeah, same thing used to happen when I'd have a bulb burn out in mid slide presentation. You get too stuck in the same hole. It's you. That was not Carolyn that I saw up there.
Okay, hold on.
Oh, look, Cali County. Was that the next one?
Yeah, that was the next slide. Hold on, I'm not sharing yet, so. We'll see if it works.
Oh, it's the chat.
Okay, try that.
Well, I still get the laser to work. Okay, you got laser power. This is an old slide from old data. You notice we had Cali County stuff in there, and that is not Ottawa, Kansas. That's Ottawa County. That's up at Minneapolis. And this was just we talk about population, and that's basically in 30-inch rows, 1, 2, 3, or 4 plants per foot. Is what that is in 30-inch rows. I got trouble with Chris Baker. Some of you remember Chris or knew Chris, know Chris, because I was looking at, I thought, you know, if you could drop about 41,000, you were in the sweet spot for Cali County. He ripped the back sheet off of my handout one time at a tour. Wouldn't show that to you guys. I really, he thought you'd get by with, and you can, with 2 plants per foot. But in a good year like 94, would 1 more plant per foot have paid off for itself at about 20 bushels? It would have. Now, it isn't going to happen every year either. So it's somewhere in that, and that was not, that was actual plants. That wasn't seed drop. That we went in and thinned it to that. So that was 3 per foot, which was a little heavy. And I would have agreed with him. At 40 to 45,000 is probably still your sweet spot down here. But you guys know that it's going to be different in different fields. You can see if you've got a bad year, it doesn't really matter. Big thing here was when you look at this one up in Minneapolis, that was weed pressure did that. You had a nice open canopy. It would look like check rows that I used to see when I went up into North and South Dakota when I was a kid. Except for the pigweeds, but they filled in the spots. Harvey County, that's a grain sorghum growing area, period. You know, and if you plant earlier, if you plant later, you're going to push that population a little bit, even though you might not want as much. You're not going to get the heading factor. You're not going to get the tillers. That's not any different now than it was in 1980 or 93 or 94 last century. It's still the same. Ignacio again was going to hit those. How'd you get that to do that, Kelsey? Pointed that or that, or am I on the wrong side? Then maybe we'd do it if I pointed it at this.
I'll just stay up here.
Sarah, in the back of my pickup, there's a toolbox, and I got a 16-ounce hammer in there. And if you bring it in, Kelsey will beat me with it. So grab that rod I've got stuck to the range measure so I can defend myself.
Is that the next slide?
I think so. Yeah. Okay. That's a
Because your Zoom people can't see it yet.
okay.
We're gonna have to manually do
I
this.
probably was sweating into the.
I don't think it's you. I think it's.
Okay. I could, okay.
I'll stay here.
This was just a row spacing thing. We did, Wellington was one of the places we did this. So Randy, I direct Sumner County into this. Isabel, are you guys familiar with where Isabel is over on, it's on 160, just into Barber County. Well, it's not just into, but, well, it is just into. But this was 98, so this was not long after the Freedom Farm Bill was passed. And we were doing a lot. So Sumner County went from being the largest wheat growing county in the nation to the largest wheat and sorghum acreage county in the nation. Or at least the production, like had 500,000 acres of both crops. So I thought Wellington was a natural place to put this, but we did have some in Cowley County as well. This is 2-3 years of stuff, but we planted May 10th and May 30th, or early May and early June in 10 and 30 inch rows. And you can see when we were up in those 100 bushel yields that, so if you just split these right here, a little bit of a yield advantage to the 10s, a little bit of yield advantage to planting earlier. And again, the 10s were a little bit higher. You get in a tough environment over here at Wellington, didn't matter the later we planted, but you can see that was a big difference in our planting dates. It's about 3.5-4 weeks apart is what they were. So it, things can happen. And, but usually I wouldn't see that big of a disparity, but that was there the year we did this, or at least the 2 years, second year. So my 10 inches were a disaster that year. Something, had a very mellow seed bed. I got the planter in a bit too deep. We had a hard rainfall. It was no-till and it caved in the sides and the sorghum couldn't get up out of it. That sorghum will come from pretty doggone deep. I've seen it come from 3-4 inches without really slowing it down if the soil's warm and get out of the soil. But that's not the goal, is to go that low. You know, it's a, 1.5-2 inches. I'd like it at least 2. I'll let Ignacio talk about that. I'm ready for the next one. Sorry, because I'm already over. No, I'm not over time, but I will be, and I don't want to be.
Okay, hold on.
I hate to set the table like that. That's a good looking tile slide. Edmund was a Mennonite, so I did ask him before I ever showed that picture anywhere, and if it was okay if I used it. And he said, yeah. I actually sent him a big one of it, so he was even. I think that helped a little too. So. One of you guys was holding up, you said you were going to be planting a little middle row. Who was that? Was that one of you guys, Roger? Well, what side of the road width are you looking at? 15 inches. 15, okay. I like 15 just because I can get between. The thing is, you can't cultivate if you have to. And if you're not done with weed control, you're going to run over stuff, run over it in corn too. You run over beans. Sorghum's a little pickier. How many of you are going to use a starter fertilizer with the planter? You like to slow it down? I always told guys, I think it's a good idea, especially if you're planting a little bit earlier or you're in a tougher condition. A lot of good stuff. Let's skip through that. Using the starter will help. It'll work together in the phosphate. As long as you got phosphate in there, you'll get more phosphate uptake. And you guys can get into some issues down here with the ability of that plant. Nitrogen's going to move. The phosphate ain't going to move. The roots have to grow to it. And that nitrogen will help those roots develop and move further, because you've not got to run into it. That and potassium both are like that. They're very immobile in the soil unless you're applying manure on top of the ground. And of course, it all runs up the Grand Lake, and we have multi-state issues that we get to deal with. Next, please.
Thought I was going to get you the next one. Did I? I did.
Oh,
This one?
back up one more. Nope. Yeah, there we go. Where do you put the starter? I think Dorvar Reese, as our soil fertility specialist, is going to be on next, but this slide has been around longer than he has been. But I stole this from Dale Lycan, and I don't know who Dale stole it from. Some of you may remember Dale. But your broadcast, that'll work, especially if you're going on phos. If you're really low though, I like to see it, and it's much more efficient if it's below the soil surface. And that just works really well, whether it's a 2x2 like this is supposed to depict, or even a little deeper under the seed, you, sometimes, you know, if anybody, does anybody here strip till? Okay, I really like that apparatus. It allows about 5 degrees more warmth in the earlier spring, and it also allows you to get your phosphate and your potash and your nitrogen down below too. And it dries out a little bit quicker. You can dry places that maybe you couldn't plant on, but you can, you've got a decent seed bed. I really like the strip till operation. Whether it's in Western Kansas where it holds on to more of the soil, or here where it gets us drier and we can go quicker. But do you use a starter? You guys?
On the plan, yeah.
Okay, where do you place it at? Oh, do I do? Okay, well, you know, with wheat, the same way we've kind of done you can put it in contact with that seed, but you got to be really careful. If you don't have to, I'll run a band on the top of liquid. That's something I've done before too, and it's just not that hard. Or even a liquid band that's on a seed firmer, as long as there's some distance between it and the seed. But that's not a very big seed. You can really mess it up pretty quick. So it's best to see somebody else have that bad experience than you're going to be an example one way or the other. It's best to be a good one, or not one that you did to yourself. Oh man. Okay, I did cover the hybrid thing over just for kicks. We had 4 different hybrids. The starter effects. This was done up at Belleville. You can see he was not lacking for phos in that soil. But hybrids respond differently, and your seedsman should know that. And if he doesn't, you know, you could try that yourself. But this is days to half bloom, and that's the key. You know, we're trying to get it along earlier because you know what? If we get into September like we did this last year, it's going to sit there and sit there and sit there. And but some hybrids do not respond, whether that's in a good phosphate situation, even with 35 pounds more that you put on, or 30 pounds more. Without, it took longer for that plant to get to that half bloom. So it was setting itself up later in the season. Now, oftentimes that later in the season is going to be drier. You're going to put more stress on that stock. No amount of potassium chloride is going to keep it standing up if things don't work right. This is kind of that same slide in a tabular form. See, it took 65 days for the hybrid to get, on average, those 4 hybrids to get to half bloom. And you can see, you know, putting a little bit of phos down helped a little bit, whether it's 2x2 or dribbled. Just straight nitrogen did the same thing, but then when you started combining them, I think the sweet spot was right in here in this 30-30 range. On average, by using a starter, it picked us up 6 to 8 days earlier into the season. Now that works great. I've got a study that was done at El Dorado in the 80s, where what it did was wreck the sorghum because it got hot at the wrong time. The early stuff, the stuff that had the starter, did not yield as well because it was all down in the boot. It happens. Okay, on the yields. Now remember, these are the same 4 hybrids in the same order, so you can see those that we got to bloom quicker yielded better than without. And there just was no difference. Those hybrids were not responsive, those outside 2. Check with your seedsman, that's where you get it. Yeah, they did all get, I think it's supposed to be 130. Somebody had 10 pounds of nitrogen, didn't mean that much back then. Now it's a little different story. But, you know, we had a kind of a, you know, a 3-week range of planting days based on those years that was up there. It's a 3-year study. Again, there's the yields, the average, the check that did not receive any of it got 120 pounds of N, but it did not get any phos on that 45 pound or that 45 ppm type of soil, got 93 bushel. But we really kicked on. And again, this right in here was a sweet spot, about a 30-30. That 1-to-1 ratio seems to work really well to get even on a lower peak tested soil. that 1-to-1 ratio seems to be the most responsive that we get. They really work well together. If you're having capabilities. Now, personally, I didn't like dumping bags all the time when I was a kid, but I wasn't paying for the food and the rent and all that kind of stuff either. So I didn't have a vote yet. It's what my boys got that lesson too, even though I wasn't farming. They had no vote because they weren't putting anything into the coffers at home. They were just draining. Two spigots there. Thank goodness I got it. Now I got 5 little ones that they're doing that same thing to those two. So that'll teach them. Getting it dried down with the starter across those hybrids. We were down to harvest moisture by October 15th. We still were lagging about 10 percentage points of moisture. And that was the average of those other 4 hybrids stuck together. But they didn't dry down as quickly either. They got to bloom later. They were lesser yield, and you were waiting on them longer. That could be good or it could be bad. But again, unless you're used to dealing with Heston headers, or you have if you're 30-inch rows, you've got a row header, you're good. But pickup reels and that kind of thing, I had to deal with those when I was a kid. Dad was not a pleasant person to be around when we were doing that. And again, you can just see that, and that was the differences in the starter units themselves. No starter, and this was the 30-30 down here at the bottom. And yeah, Kelsey, you printed those off, didn't you? Yeah, so thank you for that. I hadn't even thought about that. Again, sorghum can conserve water. It don't use a lot of water. All those crops, you saw that slide with the ET on it. Yeah, 22 inches. That's it's a luxury type of thing. Soybeans will use a ton of water. So will cotton. I had to go through that with a class up at a guest lecturer, and I was getting green arrows shot at me all over the place, kind of like an eco-terrorist telling that. Because they've been told from somebody else, well, the cotton just uses a ton of water. Well, it will. So will soybeans. They'll grow like canopy. But it doesn't take as much to get a good yield back out of that. And it's the same with the sorter. You can get by on less. Now, it's a little drier in that top foot of soil at the end of the year, or can be. But you're trying to avoid stress. You're trying to conserve water. Selecting the right hybrids, getting that good planting time on there. Seeding rates, I did a brief run over these guys, and your row spaces. And again, Sarah, yes, that should have been first. The weed control has always been an issue with sorghum. It's kind of like growing pigs versus the cattle. They didn't invest the money in the sorghum. So, no, they being seed companies, they're oversight companies, they're just not the return buck on it. Period. That's very rare that you'll have. If you look, that's sorghum. You can tell where the tillers are. That one hasn't started blooming yet. That one's done. That must have been the main one. But they're about half done. I've seen that was one of my favorite pictures just south of that's across the road from the landfill. I still remember where I took that one. Any questions or observations? Nobody's chatting. Good. Okay. Oh, excuse me. Did you ever hear that?
Do you, with that later planting, soil temperature warming, do you see that there is a time that you don't plant or you don't use starter fertilizers?
You know, that's a really good question. I don't think these were all Mother's Day to Memorial Day type planting days, is what those were. They were going for the sweet spot. Later in the year, on the start, when that's all 70 degrees, you're almost sprouting to come through the growth at the end of by the time you get out of the field. If you were using the 2 rows we had, you would have been. But no, I don't think it's as necessary then if you're on a very low peat tested soil, potentially. But you know, I haven't looked at that. I can't really tell you for sure. It would make sense that you may push it along a little bit because you are going to run into the end of the season. But you guys, when's your first freeze down here? About the 20th October, maybe, or a hard freeze? 15th to 20th. It's about fly free day, right? Or 2 weeks. That's how they set those things up. There was some science involved, but practical sense made. That's a good question. Sarah, we have to have Ignacio and Dora work on that. We can do some of that this year. They could. Made it. You guys may have seen it the first time. No, I can stretch it out. Thank you. Glad you guys could show up, and we'll be around till if something comes up. Don't feel free to, or don't feel hesitant to come get me, and we can go talk.
Okay. Next, we're gonna have Ignacio. Ignacio, are you ready?
Yeah.
Great, so you should be able to share from where you're at.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you here, yep.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay. I will start so we will get back on, hopefully we'll get ready for the lunch. So my presentation is between lunch, so we don't wanna get too long. So I will try to touch base on a few points, and Stu probably already talking in several issues, but I will show a few things that we are doing and then some other points on the sorghum production section. So let's start from the first point, and Stu probably touch base on this. We will talk about hybrid selection. Stu already did that. Crop rotation is another factor. We are seeing benefits on the rotation on sorghum with other crops, on specifically more when we are looking at cereals or legumes. Planting date, Stu mentioned a little bit about this, so I will show some of the data that we put together from the last couple of years. Row spacing, specifically more on the benefit, not much on the yield, but we will talk about the weed control. Most likely Sarah will touch base on this. So I will skip the weed control since we have an expert there. Seeding rate, specifically, I will show some of the examples that we have on on-farm research. Dorival will be touching base on fertility, and then the scouting as a big part of the component of the yield. So when you look at the productivity of sorghum, it's not about one factor, it's about multiple factors. So I will show some of the new studies that we are doing on this. I always start with the phenology, growth and development. So going back to the basics. It's a very tolerant to heat and drought, but it still has issues. It's a crop that if we don't have any rain and if we have very poor fertility, it will not respond to the potential. So we need to start thinking about those components. And I always say the critical time for sorghum to increase yields is usually around those 2 weeks, around blooming time, flowering. Any stress conditions that we have before and after blooming, flowering, are really making an impact on the crop. And I will show some of the new research that we are doing at this point. We have conducted a study that looks at the last 60 years of sorghum hybrids. And we are collaborating with that with pioneers. So we look at all the hybrids from the last 60 years to understand what was a specific gain in yield and what are how much progress have we made in terms of basically improving the bottom line of productivity. So this is one of the key components always to understand the growth stages and the phenology of the crop. And why I'm saying this is because if you look at the water use, and Stu mentioned this, on the water side, we always say that sorghum is more tolerant, but also we need to recognize that sorghum in many situations is more tolerant or less susceptible to drought because the yield potential is quite different compared to sorghum. So if you look at sorghum, if you're in a very good environment, in an excellent, not water limiting environment, corn might be able to yield 300 bushels and sorghum might be able to yield, based on some of the studies that we have, 200 or 250 top. So we recognize that they have different potential. And also the other point is that that's why also when we are looking at the common environments that we usually put sorghum, we are seeing that it still is tolerant to stress. I mean, and specifically it's also because the lower productivity and also for increasing water use efficiency connected to how is the way that it's using water. If you look at the water use changes over time during the growing season, you will see that sorghum has a peak on water use that is usually around this moment that we mentioned before, 15 days before, 15 days after flowering time. And that moment at that peak is when we are seeing that we have that water requirement that is usually around 0.3 inches per day. So if you look in a week, you will need at that moment at least to have 2 inches of water available so the crop can basically increase and maximize growth. Anytime that we don't have that, it's a potential issue because we are seeing that that crop is not growing to the maximum. And then we start seeing problems like what we tend to see in many situations. At that moment, we start seeing that flowers are not fertile because we're seeing issues on even physical restrictions. We see that the panicle is not coming really all the way through in many hybrids. We're seeing problems of how well those flowers are being exposed. We're seeing then immediately after pollination, I mean, we're seeing also problems of abortion. Many of these small flowers, they tend to abort. I mean, just to give you a quick idea, in a sorghum panicle, we might probably have at the end of the day, in many situations, 4,000 grains. But we have a potential in many places for more than that, 7,000. So we have a lot of, I mean, small flowers that they tend to abort. And that's one of the main issues that we are seeing, that if we don't have enough water at that moment, then we still are losing in some way yield potential for sorghum. And then if you compare, and then that's what also Stu mentioned before, if you compare across different crops, and Stu, of course, he always thinking about cotton. So on his mind, he was talking about cotton. So if you look at cotton, in this graph, it shows that, yeah, it's one of the, if you look at the efficiency or tolerance to drought, is one of the most tolerant. Why we are saying this is because you need to have a very low water potential level. So very low water available in the soil and high stress. So cotton start to react to that, okay? Has much more or less sensitivity. Then it's coming sorghum, and then you see soybeans, and then the most sensitive to any stress, really sensitive, is corn, okay? And this is something that we always use as a concept, but we never have this information at hand to really see that if you have this type of the same stress in your field, corn is the most sensitive, then is coming soybean, and then sorghum and cotton are the less sensitive to that drought conditions. And that's why we are always thinking about sorghum as a really good option in drought environments. As mentioned before, we always talk about the yield components, and I want to bring the yield components back because we need to understand that one of the most critical times for sorghum is the flowering, and it's a moment that 15 days before we are forming those grains, and the 15 days after we are making sure that we set the kernels, we set those grains. The seeds per head, at the end of the day, when you look at what are the main yield components for sorghum, the number of seeds per head contributes to 60% of the yields, okay? Of course, the number of heads per acre is basically what is giving us the plant density. So if we have like 20,000 plants that each one has at least 1 or 2 tillers, we might finish with 40,000 heads. So for sure, the head number is another critical component for you. But if you look at the size of the kernels, the final size, look at the numbers, and we have similar values, so that contribution to yield is very small, which basically is telling us that if we have good conditions around pollination time, blooming time, and if we can set a good number of grains, then we will set the crop into a really excellent potential yield, because the rest of the yield is not coming much by seed weight. Most of that is coming specifically by how many plants we have in the field or heads in the field, and specifically on the grain number per head, okay? And those are the main things that we need to understand when we are thinking about also planting dates. We will touch base on that in a moment. So if you're thinking about planting too late, we need to think about how are we timing the crop in terms of pollination. Is the crop getting into pollination in the middle of July, or is the crop getting into pollination in the middle of August? If we get in the middle of August, we know that we will have higher chances of getting good weather conditions. If we go to something that is in the middle of July, we have a high risk of less precipitation, high temperatures. So those are things that we need to think about, timing that blooming time with potentially best conditions, so we set the crop into a high yield possible for the area. We also have some things that we never talk too much in sorghum, and I want to bring those points. We discussed a lot about this on corn, but we have a lot of issues on early season. So many situations we tend to plant sorghum in any situation, and then we are seeing many fields that we are having these problems of missing plants, wide row gaps. I mean, they're basically hard to compensate, because even the plant can tiller. We need to understand that there is a limitation to that ability to tiller, okay? And we will see some information that if we are planting too late a sorghum, the ability for that plant to compensate is shrink and is reduced, and it's not there, okay? So unless we put more plants, or we compensate, or we take care of this uniformity problem, that ability disappears. When are we seeing more tillering and the crop has more chances to compensate is when we are planting a little bit early. The problem, the compromise that we have is that if I plant too early, I know that I will put that pollination flowering in the worst time ever. So just bringing this point, uniformity is important. It's less important than in corn, yes, okay? But it still is quite important. So we have issues of poor stands. I mean, here is one of the examples. And in many situations, these plants cannot compensate. So anytime that you are missing and you have big gaps, in many situations, you cannot compensate. And if you look at the picture, not only the gaps, but also you have lack of uniformity, plants that they came in some situations a week or 2 weeks after. Some of those plants that they are coming after, they usually also, they tend to act not as a sorghum, but more as a weed that is in the field using resources and nutrients, and it doesn't do much because it will reach pollination 1 or 2 weeks later, and basically it will be always behind. And we will see all the time problems of maturity and issues at harvest. Similar issues on compaction. So, I mean, this is something that we put together many years. We have a handbook on all potential issues, and compaction is always still something that we need to consider. We have sidewall compaction, seeds are too small. If we go press too much, if we go too deep, we will start seeing problems of sidewall compaction. And then we are seeing this, that this will complicate emergence. And in many situations, when you go to the fields and you see missing plants, most of the times it's because this. And of course, depends on soil texture, and of course, depends on environmental conditions immediately after planting. But it's something to keep in mind. Here is another example that when someone is saying, I can go, for example, to plant late, and this is an example that of late planted sorghum, we plant the same hybrid, okay, the same day. The only thing that we did is that we changed the planting depth. And you might see the difference, and you might ask, why are so much difference between a shallow versus 1.5 versus a 3-inch? And I will tell you the difference. The difference is that when we plant, we have very dry conditions. We put this around June, the end of June, very dry conditions. We are always expecting some rain. We expected a week, we expected another week. So the rain came, but it came really late, and it came extremely late. So here is a situation of timing your planting and your depth with water and with soil moisture. So if we were putting that seed on the shallow, really close to the surface with no moisture, you see that that plant, basically what shows the difference on the plant size is the plant came really late when basically we have some water after some rain. And then even when planted at the same day and the same hybrid, we have a big difference because these seeds that we put it at 1.5 inch, or even if we put it at 3 inch, those seeds were planted in contact with moisture. Okay, and this is important of having some moisture in the contact. So this is just an example of showing the relevancy not of temperature, because we didn't have any problem on temperature. We have enough temperature usually at that time of the year, but the critical factor of put in place in the seed in contact with soil moisture. And then going to my point of the issues of tillering, here is an example. I still use it. Someone might say, you are still using this, that is from 1980s, and I'm very proud of using it because we have new data, and I still like to use it in the sense of things didn't change that much on the response of tillering. And basically shows, and it's from Dr. Vanderlip, so it's one of our great mentors. I mean, so I'm proud of using it many times. So, and it shows that what is the potential response and tillering response, and what you are planting at different times. If you go really early, okay, and think about that the low population they were testing 20,000, 40,000, and 60,000, okay, seeds per acre. And if you look at the low, medium, high, you always will get more tiller contribution to yields when you are in a low density, okay? You see that, for example, if you planted early May, the tiller contribution to yield was close to 40%, okay? For that low density. When you start increasing densities, that tiller contribution tend to disappear, because then rather than just to have more space for the plants to tiller and capacity, what you're doing is you are adding more plants. As you are adding more plants, you are decreasing the ability of that crop to tiller, okay? And then in some situations, you see that in this case, for 100 bushel yield, there is almost no difference on using 20,000 or a 60,000, okay? We're talking about 3 times difference on seeing rates and no difference, okay? It's for 100 bushels, okay? If you go to another planting date, and if you go later to planting dates, look at what happens when you go late. If you go to mid-May, if you go to early June, then you start seeing more separation between plant densities, okay? Most likely the mid-June separation here is a little bit too much. I mean, if you look at the June 29 separation, is probably the ones more clear in the sense of showing that as we are going late, we have possibilities of increasing seeing rates. Because as I mentioned before, by planting too late, we are reducing the ability of that crop to produce tillers, okay? And then if I'm going way too late, I need to find a way to increase my number of plants just for 2 reasons. One, because I want to make sure that I have a shorter season, I have less months, and I want to make sure that those plants are closing the canopy. If I cannot intercept light faster, if I cannot put more plants, I will not only have issues on not increasing yields, as you see on those situations, but also I will have a lot of issues on the weed control side. I mean, and Sarah can comment on that. I mean, and that is a big issue. If we cannot close a canopy, even when we might be super effective on using a pre and a post, we are always giving open space for any seed that is on the seed bank just to come out. And it can come out at any moment, just when they germinate and they have optimal temperature and humidity, and it's coming out. So unless we do something to close a canopy, we always are exposed to this problem. And again, this proves the point that as I'm moving to a later season, and it's something similar we see on soybeans, as I'm going to a double cropping systems on soybeans, we usually recommend, I mean, increasing seed rates, just because we see that those soybeans have less ability to produce branches. In this case, sorghum has less ability to produce tillers. In many situations, 40 or 50,000 seeds per acre makes everything. So if we are in those environments, 50,000 seeds per acre are probably just closer to the optimal. I will not repeat too much, but if you think about what Stu mentioned before, we have a summary of data from the last 20, 30 years information, no? And you see that in many situations, when you look at the difference in yields, we were able to see something like this. If you plant too early, you have so much variability. What does it mean? Is that we have studies that they plant really early and they got excellent yields. And then we have some studies that they plant really early and they got very bad yields. And then you see the variability of these error bars. It shows that basically it's really hard to predict. So if someone is asking me, what is the best time for planting sorghum? I will say, start thinking about the first week of June. And why I'm saying that is because most of our data shows that we have good yields and stability. What is stability is that I can see that we have less variability, which means that we can feel a little more comfortable, that we can predict or have less noise in terms of basically weather changes and conditions. And usually by planting at that time, I know that I'm placing my blooming closer to August. So I'm just skipping that July issue that usually we have less rain and more temperatures. In terms of seeing rates, if you want to, look at this concept again, we did a few years, we have on-farm research studies looking at different seeing rates. And if you look, let's start not looking at the average. Let's start looking at 2016. We tried very different seeing rates, 20, 30, 45, 55. Again, this is all farmer fields. So we are doing big strips, okay? And then if you look at 2016, no response. If you look at 2014, no response. And then we have a year here that for sorghum, probably I might say probably this was one on 20 or maybe 30 years. One out of 20 or 30 years. It's not common to see such a high yields as we are seeing there, no? And of course, if we are really shooting for extremely high yields, then density could make a point. And then in those cases, it's showing us that, specifically this year, it shows us that if I work on sorghum in a place that I wanted to get 200 bushels, by having a lower seeding rate, I cannot compensate. I cannot just have the lowest seeding rate and expect that the tillers will do magic. So in this case, it shows that I need a little bit more seeding rate and I need to help the crop to get to that 200 bushel level. But if we go to the most real world, what happened to many of us, if we work on the 130s or 100, we are not seeing a lot of difference on seeding rates. And that is why we discussed before, in many situations is related to tillering. And then the math is the same. If I use 20,000 and I have 2 tillers average, then I will finish with 40,000 heads. If I use 40,000 and I have 1 or no tiller, so I will have 40,000 heads. So that's the math there. If I'm going to plant really late, I will feel more comfortable having at least closer to 40,000 in terms of seeding rates, just because I know that the season is really short and that sorghum will have less time to compensate. So in terms of row spacing, and Stu also touched base on this, we were also doing something very fun. We took all the information on row spacing, 10 inches, you see on this section of the graph, and 30 inches. So if the points are on the blue area, means that narrow rows are better than wide rows. If the points are in the red area, it's the opposite, no? Wide rows are better. If you look at this, the answer is not that clear. In many situations, we have this is the black line is a 1-1 line, and then in many situations we are seeing no much departure from that line. Okay, and then in the only case that we are seeing a little bit improvement of using narrow rows, I'm saying on the yield side. Okay, then we can touch base and discuss about the weed control, but specifically on yield advantage, we are seeing only that when we are around more than 100 bushels or even probably 75, then we start seeing some benefits of using narrow rows on the yield. And you see that most of the points here, sometimes the benefit can be around 10% on yields. But Sarah can talk about this later on, about the benefits on basically closing the rows and making sure that we are using narrow rows much more effective on the weed control side. So, just to give you a number, is in 66% of all the research, we are seeing benefits on narrow rows when we are about 70 bushels for sorghum. And we are seeing by far more differences, when we are about 100 bushels. So we did a study I think that was 2 years ago, also because we are talking about response to fungicide. So they wanted to understand what happens if I apply fungicide late in the season. Is there any potential benefits? So we did these studies at on farm, And then what we are seeing is, if you look at the analysis for different locations, one was on Ashland 2016, and then green one was Ashland 2017, and then we did work on a farmer field in Wichita. I mean, from our side, we haven't seen much pressure on disease. And if we don't see any pressure on disease, most likely applying a fungicide is not showing much benefit. So if you compare with the control, it doesn't seem to be a big benefit. So this idea of a physiological effect or a stay green effect in sorghum, we don't potentially see much. Of course, these are studies done in situations that we haven't seen disease pressure. So maybe under any disease pressure, we might probably see that the response might be completely different as comparing these studies. And then a few last points is talking about the desiccation effect, trying to finish the crop early. So this is some research that being done in our department. A grad student and Dr. Roosevelt, I mean, also working on production, looking at how early we can apply. And then here is a picture of a sorghum that has been desiccated using glyphosate and the one that has not been desiccated in this side. If you look at the yields, desiccated or not, were not different. So you can desiccate the crop. And if you look at the moisture, we finish very similar on moisture. So the main difference on desiccating basically is that we can anticipate harvest. And then we are not seeing that basically application has made any impact. The main challenge that I'm always mention about this desiccating sorghum is you need to make sure that it's mature. If it's not fully maturity, and the way that I'm saying this is because we need to look at the entire heads, not just the upper part of the middle part. I mean, we need to look also to the lower section of the grains on the panicle. If you look at the lower section, you need to check a few of the grains to make sure that you are in black layer, okay? If you are not, most likely what we are seeing is a potential, if you desiccate and you are not yet ready, we might see some yield impact. I mean, it's very minor, but it's there, okay? In terms of the dry down, and Stu showed some of this data on dry down, so I will just, again, emphasize dry down. We have a lot of studies, I mean, looking at dry down right now. Specifically, the dry down is there any variability on hybrids in terms of dry down? Because we want to see how quick we can just finish the crop and move, see if we can fit another crop in the rotation. What we did is that we have studies, multiple studies. This is one of the issues that we face on sorghum. Sometimes we might see difference in maturity inside of the same head. The upper section kernels are already mature. The middle section kernels are getting to maturity. I mean, and the lower section kernels are not mature. And that's one of the potential problems that we might see specifically on sorghum. One of the studies that we did is looking at sorghum that we reached black layer really early. In this case, was early September. We have in the and that situation we did have in the kernel around 36% moisture content, and we dropped that number, 36% to 15% harvest, and we usually lose less than 1 point of water per day. Okay, so basically it took this crop close to 1 month to go from black layer maturity all the way to harvest. So again, this is one of the issues that we are facing on sorghum. Can we speed this up? It's something that we are exploring, even looking at different hybrids to see if we can speed that up. It's not easy because this depends on the environment, depends on the weather conditions. What we might probably potentially see some differences of the panicle or the size of the head of architecture, if it's a little more open or less open. So we are looking at this, but just to give you an idea, from the moment that the sorghum is on black layer, it takes a month. So imagine that if your crop is reaching maturity the first week of October, most likely, in order to be on 15% harvest moisture content, you might probably be around that time in probably first week of November. So, and that will take sometimes even longer based on the weather conditions. If you have rainy conditions, if you have high humidity. So those problems are basically main things that we will be facing, and we are still facing on sorghum in terms of desiccation. And I think that just to close is something that is what we are doing right now. We are doing studies, as I mentioned before, looking at different hybrids, trying to understand how yield has been changing over time. So here is a summary of the studies that we conducted the last 2 years. We look at 20 different hybrids from the 1960s all the way to 2015s, 17s. And then you will see that, yes, there has been a yield improvement in sorghum. And in many situations, that yield improvement on sorghum, it came specifically from increasing the number of grains. So we have size of panicles are probably a little bit bigger today, but we have more grains on that panicle, okay? And then on average, the yield increase that we have in the last 60 or around 60 or 50 years is close to 0.75 bushels per acre per year. There is still a tremendous potential for sorghum. I would say that. I think that still we need to do more work, and there is still more potential for increasing sorghum yield. So I'm seeing benefits on the new hybrids, but I'm trying to think about how we can push even more. And I know that the technology and management is a big component. If we are using the best practices of management, I think that we will get sorghum into really good situations and really being part of the rotation, not just what we are seeing in many situations that the interest is coming in and out based on the price, which is, we understand that, of course, it's a big component on the decision, on farming decisions, I mean, price. But the potential for sorghum is there. And we are glad to report that basically, specifically coming from grain numbers. So that's something very interesting. And we are doing more studies looking at how we can improve grain number and management on sorghum in the next coming years. I think that I will stop here. I mean, these are just the conclusions, which I think that is everything that we have been talking on the presentation. But I want to stop here, so I leave some time for questions.
So does anyone in the room have any questions, or on the chat have any questions for Ignacio?
Two in the chat.
I think those are earlier. We're good.
The question I have for Ignacio is, your desiccation study was for an October harvest, isn't that what I saw?
The desiccation for the sorghum harvest, I mean, yes, I mean, October harvest.
Okay, so a lot of times we're shooting for a late August, early September harvest. And we found that, it's an important tool there. And then I will also tell you that if you are double cropping behind it here, you stopped water use at that point, and then also some of the allelopathic things that we have with problems with wheat behind it are mitigated with the desiccation.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, the other thing that you stop is the nutrient uptake. If there is anything on the soil, any nutrient, by desiccating, you stop that. We have seen a situation, and we have pictures, I couldn't include it here, that we cut the heads around the early September, and we went back 2 or 3 weeks after, and the plants were still green, and they were basically putting more leaves. I mean, trying to go back to, because sorghum is a crop that is a perennial crop still, and it's trying to continue the process. So unless we desiccate, or unless you want to push it quickly, you still will see water being pulled out from the plant, and also nutrients. And it's something that most likely for the next crop, you will never recover, because those nutrients are immobilized on the residues and they are not being released. So it's another additional problem if you don't desiccate.
And then another question I have is your fungicide trial, you didn't, there wasn't a whole lot of statistical data that showed improvement in yield with that.
Yeah.
In 17, what was the moisture conditions, what were the growing conditions at the time of that application?
I mean, the application was almost, I mean, in terms of moisture condition, we were in a very good place. I mean, I think that if you might ask why we are not seeing difference, I think that the answer is a little bit more straightforward. We haven't seen disease pressure. I think that once we start seeing disease pressure, I mean, most likely fungicide will be a positive component as a management tool. In this case, by not having any disease pressure, applying a fungicide on sorghum in a crop that is already kind of on a stay green is not really adding much to the crop in terms of a benefit. And I think that is something that we need to think about it. No, if I have a disease pressure, it's a good practice. If I don't have a disease pressure, it's a gamble, because you might gamble against saying that, well, I might have an issue coming in the next week or 2 weeks, but it's just more as a preventive. And I think that preventive doesn't work very well in many situations.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Really good.
All right, are there any other questions?
I guess that everyone is ready for lunch.
I think so. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and pause the Zoom and pause the recording for just a little bit, and then we'll rejoin here after a while to finish up. And if you're here present, lunch is at the back table, and you're welcome to go ahead and grab that. And Ignacio, thank you very much. And we'll just take a break for a little while.
Thank you, everyone. I wish you everyone a great planting. Take care.
Yep. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started again. We're right at noon, so if you guys could go ahead and take your seats. We're gonna go ahead and resume recording. I'll let you start your slides.
But then everything else is.
Yep, everything is ready to go. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started, and we have Dr. Duragar Ruiz Diaz here with us this afternoon. And we'll get you out of here on time, and make sure that you hold on to your questions. If you are joining us virtually and you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat to everyone, and then that way we can make sure we get those asked for you at the conclusion.
Okay,
good morning or good afternoon, I guess now. Thank you so much. Glad to be here. I think it's interesting, the hybrid option we have in person, and those of you joining us online as well. Just glad to be back and move forward with some of these meetings, which again, we're kind of missing. So my name is Dorival Ruiz-Diaz, soul fertility specialist. In this session, we'll talk about fertility management. I know Stu already talked a few things on fertility as well, but we'll build a little bit more on that as we go. So one of the things as we go along, please don't hesitate to ask questions. Again, same for those of you joining us online. Again, like Casey mentioned, just put in the chat. We'll get to it at the end for sure. I think that's the best part of the meeting, the questions. And so just kind of to start here, a few things I wanted to put in context for sorghum. Obviously looking for top yields and ultimately return to investment. Again, go back to the key nutrients here: nitrogen, phosphorus, pH can be a challenge in some cases, so we'll touch a little bit on that. We do see more and more sulfur as well becoming maybe one factor that we need to look at more closely. We've seen a lot of response mostly in winter wheat, but we start to see more in corn and sorghum as well. Okay, micros, I'll touch on that as well, but typically I would say on top of the list for sorghum, I'll definitely look at zinc and chloride. Those tends to be the most limiting ones. Just early this week, I was talking with somebody about micros in sorghum, and some labs, they may give you recommendations for other micronutrients, and a lot of that depends on what lab you're using. But what we're seeing is typically, zinc and chloride will be the one that I will watch more closely, and where we tend to see more yield benefits. And so before we start, just wanted to do kind of a little bit of review also, and this is a review for most of you guys, but in terms of soil testing, and one of the questions, of course, is can we still do soil sampling at this point? What are some things we need to keep in mind? And something to just to kind of give a big picture here, we do have basically two groups of nutrients, typically when it comes to soil sampling: immobile nutrients, so you're talking pK, zinc, pH, organic matter, and then you have the mobile nutrients, right? And so these are the ones that are going to be moving in the profile, obviously nitrogen, sulfur, chloride. So it's a little bit different approach for these samplings, okay? And so the immobile nutrients, recommendation will be a surface 0 to 6 inch samples. And the profile will be ideally 24 inches. If we can get 18, 12 inches, that's also good. But definitely we want to go deeper than the 6 inches. And again, I know this is a review for most of you, but we do get sometimes, for example, in the lab, I oversee the soil testing lab at K-State. Just last week, we had one sample of 12 inches, and they're asking for pK, pH, and 12 inches at that depth is not telling you a lot, right? And so we need to pay attention to that sampling depth and matching that to the nutrients that we're looking at. So what about the timing of sampling? With the immobile nutrient, we do have more flexibility, but we have to be consistent. Time of the year, basically we can do fall, spring, all are good time for sampling. Some tests may be affected by sampling time, and that's usually potassium and pH. And we saw a little bit of this last fall. It was a little bit drier, summer, of course, and early fall. And guys that maybe collected sample at that point, we did see a little bit of a lower K and pH show up. And so pay attention to that. If you are seeing some of those numbers from samples last fall, it may be just because it was a little bit drier conditions. And so, again, consistency is important in terms of time of the year. Mobile nutrients, nitrogen and sulfur, particularly affected by mineralization, so we don't want to wait too much on these. I would say we're thinking about this year. I would say this is still a good time to do it, but mineralization start to pick up pretty quick now, okay? And so we don't want to go too much longer to look at nitrogen and sulfur in particular. The other thing, of course, is we do measure residual, what's happened from previous years. Do we have anything left? And that's kind of the main value of these profile mobile nutrients. So again, like I said, before we warm up too much is really ideal for this sampling. And so right now we are at that point where soil temperatures start to go up. And so again, we are in time to do it, but we don't want to wait too much more on these.
I got a question.
Yes.
On the depth, So many people just do the 0 to 6 inch. And, so that would be better than doing a 12 inch.
That's a good question. So I'm just gonna repeat the question, and for those of you, what about if you're only doing 0 to 6? Will that has any value for the mobile nutrient, right? And it still has some value, but if you think about it, your nitrogen is distributed in that profile, right? And so you are capturing only the top 6 inches with that. And so you are missing some of that nitrogen. It's going to be below. Now I'll show you some data later for sulfur that can be quite important.
So is it true that I thought I was led to believe that if you have a sample that's 0 to 6, you're just using maybe a book value or something for the 6 to 24?
Correct. That's a very good point. You basically end up using a book value, which may be right, may be wrong, right? And so that's a challenge there. If you're trying to be more precise, we don't know. And a lot of times we do have quite a bit of nitrogen and sulfur below that 6 inches, and we see that all the time, and you may be missing that. So very good point, very good question. Anything else? Okay. The other thing is also, and I get this question oftentimes, is what about collecting sample after fertilizer application? And we do want to avoid that, right? And so it's a pretty tough one to make sense of data that fertilizer applied, say, a few weeks ago, and we want to collect soil sample. There's just too much confounding there effect. So we're not going to be able to separate the effect of your fertilizer versus what basically is in the soil already. And so we want to avoid that if all possible. We do have some cases, and I get this sometimes, that maybe fertilizer was already applied and then soil sample was collected, and trying to interpret that. And to be honest with you, I usually say you just have to be cautious with that. I wouldn't trust that sample very much if it was recently fertilizer application there. Okay, so one thing I wanted to kind of put a little bit in perspective, obviously, prices, fertilizer, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but you guys know what the situation with fertilizer prices, and also sorghum, of course, grain prices much better than corn. So a lot of interesting dynamic this year for sorghum in particular. And just to put a little bit in perspective, one thing that I've been getting questioned is what about yield potential? How can we push that yield potential for sorghum a little bit more? And so I went and looked at this yield contest. Probably some of you are familiar with the yield contest by the national sorghum producers. I think it's quite interesting. Give us some information. Of course, we have to be careful how we look at it. But just like I said, I was curious and went and looked at these dryland yields in Kansas, and I think some of these were actually Iowa County. I think it showed up in some places, but 170 to 190 bushels sorghum. So that's pretty good, right? I wish we all have 190 bushels sorghum, right? And so, yeah, how many acres and all of that. So that's a very valid question. But the reason why I look at this is that, there is the genetic potential, right? And so this is telling us that, that there is a potential to get good yields. To be honest with you, all of my trials, I get, 100, 120. That's really what my sorghum yields usually are. But some guys are getting high yields. And so what that means in terms of nutrient demands. And so that's kind of what I was thinking, can we compare this perhaps to corn? And, we're getting 150, 190 bushel corn, how that compares if we want to push sorghum a little bit more that direction. So keep that in mind, if you're looking at nitrogen demands, P and K demands for higher yielding sorghum, that's something to consider, right? If we are thinking about putting a higher yielding soils, better soils, better management, we're gonna need the nutrients. That's one thing I guess I want to emphasize here. So if you look at nutrient removal with sorghum, these are for P and K. As you can see, this corn here and sorghum, you can see that, they're pretty similar to corn in terms of how many pounds of P2O5 and K2O we are removing with sorghum. So in other words, if we are really able to push that yield sorghum higher, we're going to be taking up more nutrients, and in many ways very comparable to corn. Okay, so I think that's the main point I want to make here. Since we are on this table, also something I want to highlight a little bit is look at soybeans. Soybean take up a lot of nutrients, and we know this, right? And so what happens if you have soybean in the rotation, you have good soybean yields, and then coming maybe sorghum next year, what kind of residual fertility we have left there. And so we have to keep in mind also the rotation. And so again, just to put that a little bit in perspective. Yes.
What would what's your estimation, or what would you don't have it on the graph, what's cotton's removal?
Ooh, that's a good question. That maybe is too.
Especially on K.
Okay. Oh yes, yes. And I don't have the number here, to be honest with you, but
Is that
potassium
we can find?
Yes, and potassium, cotton has a huge potassium demand. We know that, and actually the critical value we have for potassium, in my opinion, are not enough for cotton. And so that's a very good point. You guys have acres in these areas that, if you get out in the rotation, we are talking something different. And so that's a very good point.
A lot of our Milo follows cotton.
Right.
So,
and potassium becomes definitely one key factor to look at in that case. A lot of what we have right now, and I'll touch a little bit of potassium, but the recommendation we have for potassium in Kansas, to be honest with you, we really focus on corn, soybean, and wheat. We haven't really looked too much cotton in terms of the potassium recommendation. So I think in many cases we need to up that potassium rates and soil test value for cotton. And when you have in the rotation, that's a big factor. So excellent point. Any other comments, questions? Okay.
I'm looking that up right now.
Yeah. Okay. Let us know, Stu, because that's a very good point. Very good point for potassium in particular. Okay. So we'll keep moving here. One thing, and again, kind of thinking a little bit in terms of nutrient needs, and if we're trying to push yields a little bit, this graph here is yields here, sorghum yields in bushels, and here in the x-axis we have total nitrogen uptake. So this is not nitrogen application, right? This is how much nitrogen is the whole plant taking up. Okay, so basically the way we do this is we harvest the whole biomass of sorghum, basically measure how much nitrogen is there and correlate that to yields. So in other words, how many pounds you need of nitrogen to produce X amount of bushels. And so just as an example here, and I'll go through some of calculations here to put a little bit in perspective kind of the nitrogen demands that you may see in sorghum. This is an example with 150 bushel sorghum, which again is high. But if we can get 150 bushel sorghum, how many pounds of nitrogen is taking up that plant? Okay. And so if we use this same data, which is data we collected over the years, you need more than 200 pounds of total nitrogen uptake coming for that plant. So that's a lot, right? That doesn't mean you need to apply 200 plus bushel of nitrogen. So we'll work through the numbers here. There's obviously a lot of nitrogen coming from the soil, right? And so if we look at 2% organic matter, that's 40 pounds of nitrogen right there. Previous crop, soybean, in this case, 40 pounds. In the case of cotton, we obviously not getting this credit. How much we have in the profile, and this is what we talked about earlier, how much nitrogen you have in that profile maybe. The default number is 30 pounds. So if we don't have a sample, we say, well, okay, you have 30 pounds. That may be right, that may be wrong. To be honest with you, most of the time it's gonna be wrong because it's a default book value, right? And so we end up basically with over 100 pounds of nitrogen coming from that soil. So that means we need to apply somewhere around 120 pounds of nitrogen for that 150 bushel of sorghum, okay? That's not very different from corn. If you're getting 150 bushel corn, that's more or less what you're gonna apply, maybe even a little higher in some cases, right? And so my point again, thinking about and comparing this to corn, sorghum is a very resilient crop. It can do very well, in very tough conditions, but sometimes we are not providing that condition for that yield level as well, like we do for corn. And so again, just to put that a little bit in perspective in terms of the needs for nutrients. Any questions on this so far? Very good. Okay. Talking about nitrogen here, one of the things, and again, the fertilizer prices is a big question in recent weeks. How can we be more efficient with that fertilizer application? And with nitrogen, In sorghum, there's some opportunities here, and I know Stu talked a little bit about starter fertilizers and basically application of some nitrogen, with the planter. This data here is basically showing nitrogen application pre-plant and split application as a citrus, a combination of things. Basically everything applied pre-plant, or basically everything applied as a citrus and a combination. So if you look at this combination here, if you put, say, something like 30 pounds around planting time and then the rest as citrus, this kind of combination tends to be, the highest yield, okay? So sorghum can definitely benefit from that combination of application, or maybe some of it with the starter, some of it with the citrus. I did have one question. I talked to somebody in Ellis County early this week as well. He applied anhydrous last fall and thinking, the question is, is that nitrogen still there? Do I need to apply more nitrogen with the sorghum? And that would be another situation where putting some of that nitrogen with the starter can be helpful. Because anhydrous, obviously, depending on what spacing for injecting that anhydrous, you may not have access to that right away. And so again, that's where that starter fertilizer can help for sorghum. Somewhat like corn as well, but again, we do see that value. What about no-till systems? And this is a graph that I always like to show in terms of placement of nitrogen. This is with no-till for sure, UAN application. So we have that source here, but as you can see, kind of typically worst case is, broadcast, of course, but we do tend to see the improvement as you are using dribble application or if we're knifing in that nitrogen, especially no-till system. So again, placement of that nitrogen can also make a big difference. And we're thinking about how can we be more efficient with high fertilizer prices. Some of these things can make a difference. I think at the end of the day, we definitely want to put where it's needed and put it in a efficient way, the fertilizer in this case. What about inhibitors? And it's always a question for nitrogen, and it really goes back to the point of what is the risk of leaching and denitrification in particular soils. And you are familiar with your particular fields. If you are dealing with some of those heavy clays, water standing in the fields, well, that would be a candidate to look at some of these products, right? We can get some benefits. On the flip side, also, if we have potential leaches, that's where we tend to see. But in average, we see a benefit from inhibitors every year. We've done yearly studies, and we have one study what we're doing, I think it's 5 years continuously now, and we've seen 2 years out of 5 where we saw a yield benefit. The rest, we didn't see anything. Why? Because it depends on how much losses we have, right? So that's really depends on the year, and it's kind of hard to say. But at the end of the day, it's basically become kind of an insurance, right? You basically making sure, and that's going to stay there. Urease inhibitors, that's one that, especially we're doing no-till surface application, I will tend to definitely consider for sorghum. Because if we're doing, especially right around planting or before planting, we do have enough temperature that we can have volatilization losses. And again, if you're using urea or UAN, that can be helpful, in no-till in particular, okay? So those will be situations that I think definitely I will look at inhibitors. So in terms of efficiency, what are some of the key things we need to look at? Placement and time of application for sure are big factors for nitrogen use efficiency. So again, especially no-till systems. Can we inject that nitrogen? Can we maybe dribble if we're using UAN? Obviously, anhydrous is very efficient because we're injecting that anhydrous. And application time. So again, those are things that I will definitely play with those to maximize the efficiency. Additives, in many cases, like I mentioned, you may not even need additives if you are doing a good job with placement and timing of nitrogen. Okay, that's a big one. For example, the urease inhibitors. I often get this question, do I need to put agrotane or some inhibitor? And if you have rain in the forecast in the next 5 days or so, often more likely you're not going to see any benefit from any of those products, because that rain is going to incorporate that nitrogen. It's not going to be lost by volatilization. So it's always a good management. Can we apply ahead of a rain? That's right there is taking care of that issue. Okay, so overall nitrogen for 2021. and again, higher fertilizer prices. I was just talking a couple of weeks ago with my colleagues in Ag Econ, a lot of questions about this, but also for sorghum. You know, we do have higher prices compared to corn, and so I think there's opportunities there for sorghum. We need to focus on efficiency. Try and make sure we're putting that nitrogen where it's needed. Yield potential, like I say, I show you some pretty high yield there. Obviously, we are not all able to get that kind of yields, and so we have to be realistic in terms of what kind of yield potential we can achieve. Now, there is potential if you are putting sorghum in good grounds, good management. The genetics is definitely there. That's what we're seeing. And so again, those are things to think about, how we can maximize return to investment, especially given the higher fertilizer prices. And I don't know, many of you maybe buy fertilizer last fall. I don't know that. I see some. Some people did, some people didn't, right? So a lot of it's timing, right? So, okay, so switching gears a little bit, I wanted to touch a little bit on chloride and other micros. I always like to mention chloride for sorghum. There have been a lot of work for chloride in sorghum and wheat in Kansas, and we do tend to see pretty good consistent benefit, especially if you are not putting any potash in some fields. Now, if potash is already part of your program, of course, you're taking care of that, right? And so keep that in mind. Obviously, we're putting potash, you're basically putting chloride, the same amount essentially at that point. But yeah, we do get a benefit there. Usually you don't need a lot, but we do get some consistent benefit. This average of 16 sites we collected over the last few years. Again, this is soil test. We go back to what we talked about earlier. Soil test really needs to be a deeper sample to look at that chloride. And again, what we need is not a lot. You know, 6 part per million is really all we need. But again, if you are putting potash already, that's kind of taking care of that right there. One thing I wanted to touch a little bit, and this is data from Dan Sweeney, which I think is quite interesting if you're looking at potassium and also chloride, is the potential interaction with disease and lodging in sorghum. You know, we talk about high yielding sorghum. One of the challenges, of course, high yielding is that, that sorghum needs to stand up until we harvest. And that's, my wife is a sorghum breeder, and I know they talk a lot about lodging. It's a big factor because you have big heads. Obviously, that's a tough one, right? You have to keep it strong and in place. And so there is some benefit from nutrient management there, specifically potassium and chloride. Okay, and so this work, this is looking at 0 potassium, and this is 75 pounds of K, low testing K. So we have to keep that in mind as well. So think about soil testing levels that you're dealing with and whether or not it's needed. But you see the yield benefit here, but also this is severity of stalk rot, which is correlated to lodging. So basically you see a lower rating here for when you are in potassium. And so you get that benefit there. So the lodging rating also, they collected here, and it was also significantly lower with the potash. Yeah.
On the potash application, does it need to be pre-emerge, or can you put it on growing crop, or
That's
make a lot of difference?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
The soil or broadcast?
Yeah. It really, I mean, in terms of placement, there really not a lot of difference. I mean, if you have the capability of if you do strip till, for example, or if you are able to put it somehow around planting time, that's fine. If you do broadcast, it has to be pre-planned ideally. As the earlier, the better, because that's one thing with potassium. You need that potassium to move in the soil a little bit. We actually did some studies, it's still ongoing, on soybeans, where we did basically an application, citrus application of potassium, just to see if we get any benefit. And we do get some benefit. But it's not quite what you expect with pre-plant application. And so I will not recommend to wait until after planting. But it's still a valid question, because sometimes you find out that soil testing was low, you already planted. Can you do anything about it? And my opinion is yes, still good. Do it. The potassium is going to be there. Some of it's going to be used by that crop, but then the rest is going to stay there for the following crop. And so that's a good thing about K. You're not losing it like nitrogen necessarily. But ideally, it needs to be our planting time or pre-plant to get the full benefit. And so anyways, good question. And so salt is critical value, and we touched a little bit on this earlier. What we're using right now is 130 part per million. So anything that's below this, we should be thinking about K application. But again, cotton is potentially a different story. And I will be, it is not in our recommendation, but I will be definitely okay pushing this level a little bit higher for cotton, just because of the high demand of that crop in particular. And I see responses even with that kind of levels. Yes.
I did look at, our cotton requirements are just almost pound for pound what nitrogen is.
Nitrogen, right?
It'll use about the same as a nitrogen.
Yeah.
So for K, it'll use the same pounds of K as it will for nitrogen.
Pretty spot on, about the same.
Wow, that's impressive, because nitrogen is your main.
But it's all later in the season.
Right.
And most of it comes back.
Yeah.
You know, really critical.
Good. Okay, so anyways, going back to this question about lodging, and are we trying to push yields? Can we keep that sorghum standing there until harvest? Essentially, nutrition can help. But one thing I want to emphasize: fertility is not the only thing. Lodging is a very complex, factor. There's many things playing there: genetics, the yield potential, but good fertility can be helpful. I guess that's what the one thing I want to emphasize. By any means, I'm not saying that nutrient management will take care of lodging. It's just one of the factors. Okay, so obviously there are many things going on there. Okay, quickly here, make sure stay on time. Just touch quickly here on zinc. Sorghum is quite responsive to zinc, especially low testing zinc below 1 part per million. This is one example we have. This is a 0.6 part per million, and you can see the yield benefit. This was applied 2 by 2, a half pound of zinc. And so again, you get a benefit there for sorghum for sure. Sulfur, we talked a little bit about this already earlier. We haven't seen a lot of the deficiency still in sorghum, at least I haven't. A lot of the deficiency I see, sulfur deficiency has been a lot of it mostly in corn and winter wheat. However, I think we're going to start to see more and more potential response in sorghum. So I'll definitely pay attention to that. I have soybean here as one of the crops removing quite a bit of sulfur. So again, if that's in the rotation, definitely think about that. Also, what kind of soils we have. Organic matter is going to be a big factor. So we're thinking we do have soils a little bit lower organic matter, getting to about 1% or so. Those are candidates for potential sulfur response. So definitely something to pay attention to. Going back to the soil sampling earlier, this one thing about mobile nutrient like sulfur. You see, if we're only collecting, this is data collecting samples at different depths, every 3-inch increments. And if you collect the upper 6 inches, pretty low in sulfur here, right? But then you see where the sulfur is accumulating in this soil, 12, 15 inches, you have huge amount of sulfur accumulating there. And so that's what sometimes a little bit difficult to capture. If you're only getting the 6 inches, you may say, well, I'm deficient in sulfur, I'm gonna go ahead and apply it, but you may actually have quite a bit in that deeper in the profile. So that's where I think, at least every so often, I think for sulfur, I would like to see a profile sample, just to see what that soil is accumulating there. pH, just quickly again, we can have benefit from liming for sure in sorghum. Typically where we tend to see the optimum range is between 6 and 6.4. That's where we tend to maximize yields. I know there are some recommendations that will tell you to increase pH higher than that, 6.8. You may not necessarily see a yield benefit there, but if you're thinking long-term, keeping that pH closer to 7 maybe is a good thing. But economically, if you are getting a 6.4 or so, I think there's no need to worry about pH for sure in that kind of situation. Where is sorghum compared to other crops? I think it's a classic data. I always like to show this. The red one here is soybeans. In the middle, you have Milo, and then wheat, of course, is the less responsive to pH. So basically more tolerant to low pH. And we know that, especially we're growing some varieties, right? And so still go back to about that, 6 to 6.4. Once you get there, you pretty much get into close to 100% yield potential, okay? No-till and surface lime application, we've done a few trials on this the last few years. So it's a really interesting situation, of course, because especially those of you doing no-till, we're getting many people with 25, 30 years of no-till. That's not uncommon. And so where is that low pH developing? A lot of time tends to be in the upper 3 inches, where we tend to see the pH problem. And so what do we do in that case? Basically, surface application of lime, what we found is that surface application of lime is effective. We do get a benefit from it, but still you're really affecting the upper 3 inches or so, okay? And so that would be the only situation we will recommend to collect soil sample in the upper 3 inches. If you're thinking about lime application, you are no-till, you're gonna broadcast, you're not gonna incorporate that lime, I'll definitely encourage you to look at the upper 3-inch pH, and that will basically fine-tune that rate of lime application. It's a big investment, so I think we want to definitely take the time to do a good job with the application rates. So that's basically what I have. Again, just a quick points that we talk about here. Nitrogen and phosphorus always kind of tends to be a big one, so I will definitely throw potassium on that as well for management. Don't forget about the basics, pH, we can get a benefit there. One of the things with pH, though, that I often try to emphasize is that typically, at least from the data we got, is you may not get the return to investment in a single year. With liming, you have to be thinking about multi-year because it is a multi-year investment, right? When is going to be the next time you need to apply lime again? Maybe 6, 7, 10 years easily, right? And so that really extends the number of crops that you're growing with that application. So sometimes you see those yield response to lime and say, well, that's just a few bushels, that's not gonna pay for it, but that's just 1 year, right? Now count that for multiple years. It's just a little bit different economics. So think about that when you're thinking about lime. High fertilizer prices is a big concern, of course. So again, many of you maybe already have your fertilizer, not a problem, but think about it, put it where it's needed, try to be efficient as possible, use soil testing. This is a situation where soil testing really pays, know what you have in that field. In many cases, you may not need to put any fertilizer, and that's good to know. What about phosphorus? Some of you may be keeping soil tests a little bit higher. Maybe this could be a year that you maybe back up a little bit on your rates because of the high prices, and that's fine. But again, how you know that? You have to do soil testing. That's really the only way. So keep that in mind. Those are things that a year like this can definitely pay. So that's what I have. I don't want to take too much of next speaker, I think is sorry. Yeah. So any questions, comments as we're switching here? I don't know if we have any questions on the chat, or I don't know how to see that here. Can I look at it? No, I don't see anything. Very good. I'll be around. Thank you.
I got this.
Oh, yeah.
She was having. Got the same one. Oh, yeah, we are in
Right.
business. Thank you, Kelsey.
Yes, you're welcome.
All right. Good afternoon. I am trying to start a good habit here of keeping better track of my time when I talk. So here we go. So thanks you guys for coming out this afternoon. It is really great to actually be in a room with actual living farmers and talk to you guys face to face. And I'm glad the folks on Zoom, there you are joining us as well. I'll try to be cognizant of this camera. That is a trick for me sometimes. But so today we're going to talk about weed management in grain sorghum. I know Stu and Ignacio have both kind of alluded to some of the things that we're going to talk about this afternoon. So a couple of things, if you have questions, just holler. Don't feel like you have to wait till the end to ask questions. And actually, I've got a couple of places in here where I would love for the folks in the room to talk back to me. If you're comfortable doing that, if there's awkward silence for more than a few seconds, we can just pretend like it didn't happen and keep going, okay? But we're really gonna go kind of back to the basics here with weed management in grain sorghum. And so really, the messaging that we try to talk about as far as, extension weed management is start clean, stay clean. I was telling someone the other day, you never want to be on defense against the weeds. You always want to be on offense. You always want to be ahead. So my observations, and you guys here, see if I'm in line with what you guys see down here, okay? My observations are that we're looking on the slide at some of the most problematic weed species in grain sorghum for Kansas producers. So we've got our friend the pigweeds, Palmaria amaranth namely. That'd be at the top of the list. Okay, we're going to talk about this guy a lot. Another broadleaf here, morning glory has popped up on several lists. It's got that large seed. It can come up for a while during the season. Y'all don't see much down here. And then annual grasses or perennial grasses. I've got shattercane here, but Johnson grass, right? We sometimes talk about them in the same breath. Shattercane would be the annual, Johnson grass is a perennial. And so that Johnson grass can be a little more difficult to get ahead of, right? Just because of the perennial nature. But these guys are particularly problematic because, for goodness sakes, this is the exact same genus and species as grain sorghum. Okay, so very closely related. We're going to talk at the end of the presentation about some of the new technologies in terms of herbicide-resistant grain sorghum. And as a matter of fact, some of the genes that they started with came from shattercane and Johnson grass. So very closely related. And then that's large crabgrass, but there's some other warm season annual grasses that we have to stay ahead of. And really, again, when we get to the end of the slideshow and talk about some of those new technologies, that's where we will really spend some time thinking about those annual grasses. So that slide was supposed to be hidden. I did not. Okay. That's all right. We got this. So what do you guys think? To what extent have limitations in weed management kind of influenced your thoughts on grain sorghum? Have some of the herbicide limitations, the weed management limitations, Ignacio talked about just not really getting good canopy closure. Do those difficulties influence your decisions around growing grain sorghum, or is that not an issue? You're going to do it anyway. Help me understand. Oh, you know what I should have said? I have been in Kansas for 16 months now. So I love it here, love you guys, love your cropping systems, but the reason I ask a lot of questions is because I want to make sure that I'm developing my programs and my presentations to get better and better and more fine-tuned for y'all in the future. So
I would say strategically in certain fields.
Okay.
Problem child areas that we won't plant sorghum because of not shattercane so much as the Johnson grass.
Johnson grass. Okay. That helps. Okay, so that being said, we're going to go back to the basics and we're going to think about integrated weed management. So you guys know that there are pretty limited herbicide options for grain sorghum relative to some of our other cropping systems. So, really integrated management is super important for grain sorghum. And so, you talked about being careful about your site selection, your field selection, right? Thinking about crop rotation. For some of those grasses, the best way to get a handle on them is rotation, right? Rotate to a broadleaf crop. So using integrated practices, and then next up would be just being timely on applications. And I've got to tell you guys, I always feel a little bit guilty when I harp on timely applications, because I know that y'all are doing the best you can, right? It's not like you sit in your pickup thinking, I think I'm gonna wait until that pigweed is 12 inches tall before I go spray it. But never hurts to have a reminder, right? And I'll show you a little bit also here in a few minutes. We'll look at some of the height restrictions on the actual herbicide labels and talk about kind of what that means for spraying. The other thing that has been on my mind as I've been doing some of these sorghum talks this winter, kind of with the anticipation that maybe folks are going to put sorghum on acres that they weren't planning on putting sorghum on this time last year, just because of, I think Stu or Ignacio one talked about the markets, right? You guys are all in tune to that. So one of the things that's been on my mind is the potential for carryover, especially since up until the last few weeks, we've been really dry, right? Like the last couple of weeks have really shifted some things in terms of moisture. But as we think about, you can look at almost every mesonet weather station across the state and you see this big departure from normal. Okay, so this blue line here would be the normal cumulative rainfall. The red stepped up lines is what we actually saw throughout the fall and winter. So what that means is any herbicides that were out there that should have been breaking down over the fall, there really wasn't much going on. So if you've got some situations where there's potential sensitivity issues, we could see some of those even with some of this recent rain, although it does make it less likely. So as we think about, if you're rotating with soybeans, a lot of our ALS chemistries can have carryover issues going into grain sorghum. And then some of the ALS chemistries in corn as well. So just being aware of what you used last year and how that might affect things going into the spring. All right, so thinking about some weed management programs. Start clean. So maybe that means tillage, maybe that means a burn down herbicide application. Stu and I were ogling lots of purple fields as we drove down. Yeah, Hinvid, it's time to get ahead of that, right? Start clean, get your burn down applications on. And then one of the questions that I sometimes get is, can I apply my residual with my burn down? Yes, you can apply a residual with your burn down, but don't count on that application that you would make now carrying you through as long as you need it to into the season, okay? So we have relatively limited options, but some of the best pre-combinations and cost-effective combinations involve some combination of a group 27, so maybe meso, with atrazine, and then a group 15 herbicide, so something like dual or acetochlor, a metolachlor or acetochlor product. And so I just pulled up a few treatments to show you guys kind of some side-by-sides. I'm looking at this is, again, just a couple of treatments in one location in Northeast Kansas, looking at the benefit of that meso, and really, those were our top performing treatments and pretty similar with and without the meso in this particular case, and both very near 100% control in this case, okay? So thinking about some of the questions I get around using these products, a lot of it centers around how much rainfall do I need for activation is one question. And so that's what we're looking at here. Okay, so these group 15 products, we really want to see about a ½ inch on those products to get them activated. Meso requires a little less. But here's the other thing that I would say is that just because you don't think they're going to get 100% activated, right? Like all of the prognosticators on the weather are saying we're going to have a dry summer. Don't skip these guys. You might see 80% control instead of 100%, but you're going to be darn grateful for that 80% instead of 0, especially again on some of those problem fields. Okay, now thinking about, you guys all laughed at me when I talked about Palmer amaranth, which tells me that we're on the same page there, okay? And so what I did is I pulled some of the recommendations for post-emergent products for Palmer amaranth control in grain sorghum crops. Okay, so we're looking at things like 2,4-D, atrazine, buctril, dicamba, starine. Okay, and the thing I want you guys to pay attention to, I pulled some information on application timing relative to sorghum that sometimes can sneak up on us and cause us some problems. And then the thing I really want to focus on is this timing relative to Palmer amaranth size. Okay, so there's a reason the labels are written this way, and that is because the companies want you to be happy with their products, and they don't think you will be happy with the performance if you apply to these weeds at larger sizes. Okay, so Husky has a 4-inch label. Husky plus atrazine. Don't skip the atrazine if you plan on going post with Husky, and 4 inches might be pushing it. Is that fair? Okay. But the others, this is my personal favorite right here. Just make sure they're small. Well, that's all relative, okay? But you know, really, I've got a student right now doing a project looking at tank mixes with 2,4-D and Palmer amaranth control. There's not a lot of difference between 2-inch and 4-inch control. You get pretty good control across the tank mixes, and he's also looking at spray volume, so across a variety of gallons per acre. Where you start to see problems is that next increment jump from 4 inches to 8 inches, right? So we definitely want to make sure we're getting them when they're smaller. So I put the group 15s on here too, to remind me to talk about, and again, Ignacio alluded to this, the need to carry out that weed control, because you don't get, especially in wider rows, you know, that canopy cover just isn't quite there like it is maybe with soybeans. And so we really talk a lot about these layered residuals or overlapping residuals. The group 15s have a place for that as well. They have application restrictions that really aren't too far off from your other post products. And they can be, you know, especially if at the right price point, they can be very good additions to that post-emergent application. So here's my question. I told you guys I had questions for you. What are you guys thinking, folks in the room, or if the folks on Zoom feel like dropping something in the chat box, maybe we can take a look at that. What are you guys thinking for your herbicide program for 2021?
Seed clover, atrazine, and I'm losing my mind. Mesostrum.
Mesotran, so a generic Callisto.
Yeah.
And your generics, I assume.
Explore.
So yeah, that's kind of the standard. What are you thinking for post?
Hope.
Okay, I just died a little bit on the inside, right there. What else? You guys over here, what are y'all thinking?
Same thing, but I got a question on it. If you're adding Callisto to it, and you put it on, your sorghum's not up yet, you get a 2 to 4 inch rain, are you gonna injure your sorghum a little bit?
I have not
Some
seen.
of it's not labeled that.
I have not seen that, but knowing what I know about how sorghum responds to atrazine, which is a different herbicide class, but just knowing what I know about sorghum, I would say that on a lighter sandier soil, you might have the potential for that if you don't get good slot closure, things of that nature. All of those things that we think about in terms of those crops emerging through that herbicide application. I'll have to, I can look up and see what kind of data we have. I haven't laid eyes on that though. So that's a good question. All right. So herbicide resistant grain sorghum. So we started kind of seeing some splashes in the farm press, kind of the end of the summer, right? Early fall. about, in particular, this guy right here, the iGrowth sorghum. One of the things that has happened as a result of the rollout of iGrowth is we're seeing some definitive moves here with the Ensign sorghum, right? They're making some more solid steps in terms of having some hybrids available this year. And Dorvar, you might have some inside information on that, but I don't know. So Ensign and iGrowth, and then the one that is yet to come, it's not commercially available just yet, is this Double Team. Okay. So we've got 3 different herbicide-resistant grain sorghums. They're all non-transgenic, so they're all developed with conventional breeding. Okay, so there's that. Other things to think about, we'll just run through the bullet points here. The Ensign is a Corteva or a Pioneer product. The herbicide that you're looking for there is called Zest. If you have experience with Accent and corn, the sulfuron is the same product. Okay, so Zest, a very good grass herbicide, only able to apply it post-emergence. Okay, and we will have some varieties available in 2021. The next one here is the iGrowth. Okay, even though this was the first one to make the big kind of marketing splash, it's actually a little newer technology than the Ensign. So the seed company here is Advanta. The chemical company is UPL. And you've got a herbicide that they've got a label at the end of the year called Emiflex. Okay, I've been asking for pricing information on Emiflex and haven't been able to get any yet. So I'll keep you all posted when I get it. But that is a Massimox. So Beyond Raptor. Okay. So you guys have probably I've seen some nods. You guys have had experience with those products as well. The unique thing about Emiflex is that it can be applied either pre or post, okay, but not both. So you've got to make your choice. There's a little bit different rate recs for the pre versus post, a little higher rate with the pre-application than the post-application, but we'll look at some data to compare, and I'll share my thoughts, and then I'll share also kind of an opposing view on that application timing. And these guys have launched this year. There's plenty of seed available is the line that I'm getting from the company folks there. And then the last one is Double Team. Okay. So Sorghum Partners, or S&W, is the company that's developing the hybrids. The chemicals are being marketed by and put forward by Adama. The herbicide that they're going to use is going to be branded as First Act. It's a Shore, just in a different jug. Like when you pull the EPA label, they literally just got permission to put a different label on it. It's the exact same, okay? So the chemical there is Quisalofop. They are planning what they're calling a pilot launch for this summer. They don't have all of their export approvals just yet, so they're being very careful about where they're positioning this product. So there, I'm excited. I've got some trials with all of these this summer in Manhattan, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they do. All right, so this next set of slides, we're going to look at some data that was collected from places across Kansas, sponsored by Sorghum Checkoff. All of these trials were done in fallow fields. So they did it this way just because of access to seeds and approvals and all that. So fallow fields. They had a set of pre-treatments where they were basically comparing Emiflex to those group 15 products, so to dual and acetylchlor, okay? Then they had a series of post-applications where they were really comparing the three products here. So they didn't get Emiflex, they did get Zest, and they just used a Shore for the Quisalofop formulation. In these trials we're gonna look at. They had 2 rates for everything, and they had 2 growth stages. So they had a timely application, then they had a late application, okay? So first up, let's look at some green foxtail control at haze. Okay, darn it. Stay in front of the camera. Green foxtail control haze, pre-application. You can see our rating timings here. We started at about a month out and went out to 77 days. So the two rates of Imiflex, this is going to be the higher 9-ounce rate is going to be the recommendation coming from UPL for this use. But take a look at the relative differences here in our Imiflex rates compared to our Group 15 products. Okay, we go from 90+% control down to 50% control. So there's definitely some advantages there as a pre-application to green foxtail. And just to give you guys a feel, here's a photo of those plots, that middle rating, 50-day after treatment rating. Okay, so you can see there was a good stand-up foxtail there that they were comparing against and trying to control. In Garden City, they had data for large crabgrass. Now I'm going to preface this discussion by saying that the large crabgrass population was not as dense as the foxtail population that we just saw. Okay, so if you were to put this out in a heavy duty infestation, your results might not be this promising. Okay, but we can still look at some of the relative differences. So again, pre-emergence here, the two Imiflex rates maintain 90% control or near 90% control all the way to the 78-day rating. Same story for the dual. The Warrens and the Outlook did kind of fall off a little bit when they got to those later two ratings. Okay, so takeaways there. Maybe you could say that there was some slight advantage to the Imiflex there, but really I would say that they all performed about the same. Okay. Some photos just to help kind of visualize what we were looking at here. This is the non-treated check, so you can see the crabgrass, the low rate of Imiflex, and then warrants. Okay, so very clean plots there. Now let's think about the post-emergent applications. So timely application, something like 4-inch weeds. Okay, there was some variability in there, but that was the target. So here is those two rates post of Imiflex. Okay, so you can see we're getting about 80% control a month after treatment. The Assure was 80 at the higher rate of upwards of 90% control. And then the Zest was rolling in there about 70% control. Okay, so my takeaway from this, if I'm looking for post-emergent grass control, I'm liking this 10-ounce rate of the Assure or the First Act. Okay, again, this is 1 year, 1 location, 4 reps, but this is the most representative data we've got right now. So some photos to help you guys understand that. Here's that Imiflex with the higher rate. The Assure plot, I'm liking that pretty well. And then that Zest plot. Okay. Thinking about the crabgrass at Garden City. Again, smaller weeds here, something like 4-inch weeds when they made the application. So they had really excellent control across the board with all of those, but again, didn't have the pressure there that we did with the foxtail at Hayes. So, as far as early control or getting control fast, that 10-ounce rate of Assure had the greatest control of that 14-day after application rating, but really not a lot of differences there. All right, so weight post. As an extension specialist, you really can't ask for a better data set than this if you compare that early post to the late post control when I want to fuss at folks about making timely applications, right? Didn't matter what they put out, they didn't get over 30% control of that foxtail. This was like 12-inch foxtail, something in that ballpark, okay? And the same thing, I think the crabgrass was actually a little bigger than the foxtail. They were more like 14 inches when they got these applications put on. But the high point here was that 10 ounces of Assure. At that second reading, at the third reading, there weren't a lot of differences. They were all in there about 70% control. Okay. So the long and the short of this is, guys, yeah, we can control grasses post, but if we think about these as rescue treatments, we're going to be really disappointed in their performance, and we're probably going to burn out this technology pretty quickly. Okay, so just thinking about that, if I had to think about, particularly, let's think about this ImiFlex system, this pre versus post question, because I've gotten some questions on it. I've got some trials planned to put out to try to answer this question this summer. But really looking at what data I have, I like this 9 ounces pre. If I have to choose pre or post for that ImiFlex, I'm going for that 9 ounces pre. You're using it to control grasses. I like to be on offense with my weeds. To me, that's what makes sense. There are some folks out there that are suggesting that maybe that post-application timing is better. Maybe you won't even need that application. We're gonna be friends. I like this. You're hoping, right? It's not as good as hoping. To me, that doesn't make a ton of sense when you look at, you're paying for the tech fees anyway. You may as well get what you're paying for as far as controlling those grasses. So there are two different schools of thought out there. As a weed scientist, that's kind of where I land, is using it pre. Some other things to think about, rotational restrictions here. You know, these are ALS inhibiting herbicides, which, well, these two are ALS inhibiting herbicides, which are prone to taking a little bit longer to break down in the soil. So thinking about zest, if you want to come back to beans or weeds, really no restriction there to beans, but 4-month rotation to wheat, 10 months to cotton, 10 to 18 months to canola. And then here's the thing to really pay attention to. For the zest and the ImiFlex, so for the enzyme and the iGrowth, they don't want grain sorghum 2 years in a row in that field. Okay, and we're going to look, I think it's the next slide, at some of the stewardship measurements that are built into these labels, and that's really one of them, is to break up that rotation and not have sorghum on sorghum, even if it's not the same technology. Does that make sense? That's the way those labels are written. So the Assure, one of the questions we sometimes get is plant back restrictions for these ACC inhibiting products. And there actually is a 3-month plant back restriction for those products to go to another grass crop. We typically think of them as being only active post-emergence, but for safety's sake, that the labels are written with that 4-month restriction there. All right, stewardship. The big thing we're worried about here in terms of stewardship is maintaining the usefulness of this technology by not getting herbicide-resistant weeds. So a lot of these practices are designed to slow the development of herbicide-resistant weeds. I'd like to say prevent, but I'm not sure that's super realistic. So we're managing to slow the development of herbicide-resistant weeds. So one of the ways we're doing that, particularly with these ACC inhibiting ALS inhibiting herbicides, is to limit the number of applications per year. With ImiFlex, we get 1. With Zest, they get 2. Okay. And then here, don't plant the grain sorghum in the same field for 2 consecutive years. And then do not plant where ALS-resistant sugarcane or Johnson grass occur. One of the things that's interesting about these labels and how they're written, we said at the top of this presentation that some of our biggest problems are Johnson grass and shadowcane in terms of grassy weeds. They're actually not listed on the labels for these products. Okay, so even though we can control them with these herbicides, we don't want to plan on using them. You talked about positioning your rotation, right? Where what fields you're gonna put your product in. Even with this new technology, we still don't want to try to put grain sorghum in a field where we know we have problems with Johnson grass or shatter cane, because we're just asking for outcrossing. We know that the pollen can go from the sorghum, from the grain sorghum to the weeds. And so we don't want to have any chance for that happening. So not only does that mean watching and not putting them where you know you have a lot of problems with Johnson grass and shatter cane, it also means taking care of field borders and ditches and things of that nature, so that those weeds are not there, even outside of the field. Okay. This data is kind of interesting. So, you know, one of the label requirements is not to use these technologies where you know you have resistant Johnson grass or shatter cane. These data are a couple of years old now, but really they're the only published data that I've been able to put my hands on. So what Rodrigo did here is he surveyed shatter cane and Johnson grass populations, and he was at the University of Nebraska when he did this work. So Nebraska and Kansas were his primary focus. Okay, so if you look at these dots, the black diamonds are where he sampled and where he found that the population was susceptible. Green means it was resistant to nicosulfuron. So here for the Johnson grass, and then these two spots for the shatter cane. They actually did pursuit instead of raptor for their IMI screen, but the blue dots are where we found imidazolinone resistant biotypes, and then the red dots indicate both. Okay, both of those ALS inhibiting chemistries. So I say that to say, I mean, we're here, right? So I say that to say, even though, well, A, they didn't sample down here, but these resistant populations are out there. So just because they haven't been reported and put a pin on the map doesn't mean that they're not there. Here's my last question for you guys, and I'm curious because this will help me with my extension programming. Which of these technologies is of most interest to y'all? The Ensign, the iGrowth, or the double team, or none of them?
One that's gonna work.
That depends on the situation, right?
The double team, as they spray it, it's gonna frustrate you when you go out there a week later, because it is slow to work. It's working, but it takes a long time to finish the job. But I also think that that's one of the reasons why that technology may be just a shade better in certain circumstances, because it's working. It's less of a burner effect, so to speak, and then you get a rain and we regrow through it. I've talked with a couple of guys that had double team and iGrowth trials on their farm outside of Garden City, and is much happier with the double team trial than he was the iGrowth. We had a double team trial on us last year in double crop.
Yeah.
And we were very happy with the control, not only of crabgrass, but also of volunteer wheat.
Okay, good. So yeah, it's interesting. So you've got those two ALS inhibiting herbicides. So they're not super fast acting. You start to see the general yellowing probably a little sooner. But yeah, so when we think about Quizalahop, those are grass herbicides, right? Like that's what they're designed to go for, or those annual grasses or grasses in general, and annual and perennial. So I think one of the questions I get is about iGrowth on pigweed. Yeah, it's not a recommendation. You're gonna have to put something else out there for it. So other things to bring to y'all's attention here in my last couple of minutes, so I can leave about 5 minutes or so for questions here. Atrazine registration review. So I had an interesting conversation with the folks at Kansas Farm Bureau not too long ago about, how can university weed scientists and agricultural, I don't want to say advocacy organizations, but grower organizations, How can we partner together to address things like herbicide resistance and making sure that farmers have the tools that they need to manage weeds? And, quite frankly, at the end of the day, especially, I have to be careful how I say this, but especially in certain political environments, we need to do a good job of telling how important these chemicals are to us. Because believe me, the folks that don't want us to use these chemicals are spending a lot of time getting attention from the EPA. So I have just said, and the folks at Farm Bureau also said, we're going to do a better job of pushing out to you guys when these public comment periods are open and when to have a say. Like the commodity groups and Kansas Farm Bureau do a good job of even providing some kind of bullet points to draft your statement. Quite honestly, it takes longer to navigate to the right spot on the internet than it will to type your statements in. But it's so worth it. As a specialist, I get sometimes asked to submit comments. And I'm nosy, I guess. I scroll through what everybody else is saying. You're nodding like you've done this too. Yeah, what's it look like?
It's interesting.
It's interesting. So the thing that caught my attention is that there's like hundreds of exactly the same thing that basically just says farmers are evil and herbicides are bad. And so if we can come on as agricultural groups, if we can come on there with, specific statements about how we use these herbicides and what they mean to our farm.
For joint efforts across the one group will do something individually, the other group try. Why aren't they collectively pooling resources?
Yeah, that's a great point too. I know a lot of times we'll see, like on the state level, or we'll see letters submitted to Congress,
Right.
Congressmen from
Right.
the group, but I'm not sure how much of that collective
Of course,
effort
they're
happens in the EPA.
competing for their particular, so they're, it's.
We're on the same team, but we're not. Yeah. So the other thing to think about, the Endangered Species Act, guys, is going to change the way we do business. Yeah.
I will just tell you guys too, and anyone that's listening online, please, this is a imperative issue, and your livelihood and your ability to make a living from the land that you own is at risk. And, I am the vice chairman of the National Sorghum Growers Association, and it is a producer funded organization. It's not your checkoff dollars do not go to us. You have to pay your dues. And I don't care if you're a Corn Growers Association member, a Wheat Growers Association member, those are all dues paying membership organizations. And this is why I go to Washington, DC, so I can talk to EPA, so I can work with the Ag Committee, so I can work with USDA. And when you don't spend your $100 a year to join these trade organizations, it becomes incredibly difficult for us to defend our way of life. And so I would just encourage everyone to please be a member of your commodity organization, and they're there in your best interest. And it's pretty cheap insurance policy to be able to continue to do the things that you like to do and to earn your living the way you want to.
Yeah, you can feel how you want to feel about the political process, but it is what it is. And if we don't have a strong voice, we'll get run out.
They're always engaged. Your adversaries are always engaged at every level. And we need to be able to be engaged at every level as well.
Yes. On that happy note, if you haven't seen Kelsey or Randy to get your weed control guides, please do so. Also, it's available online. And then I don't know if any of you guys are podcast listeners. That's kind of how I pass my commute. Is listening to podcasts, and maybe as you think about doing field work or in the fall hauling grain or whatever, there's that windshield time. I have a podcast with some friends and colleagues of mine from Missouri and North Dakota. So we kind of cover a broad geography. We've pulled in people even from the East Coast. So we're covering, a broad geography, a lot of different interests, but our podcast is called War Against Weeds. So if you just Google it, look for it in the Google, whatever, however the people that listen to podcasts, you can find us. But it's been fun for me. Like I've learned some things talking to people from across the country and just trying to stay applied, but also kind of take a deeper look at things than what we can talk about in a 30-minute or a 1-hour presentation. So I would implore you to take a look at that. I left myself 5 minutes. Any questions from the folks online or any other questions from the folks in the room? I appreciate y'all's engagement and conversation. It's so much more fun for me to have a conversation than to give a lecture. So anything else? Anything else, Kelsey? All righty. Thank you, guys.
So Sarah, where are you from?
So that's a good question. I grew up about an hour west of Missouri. An hour west of Missouri. An hour west of St. Louis in Missouri.
She announces you. Oops.
Is that Barton or Elderwood County?
Yeah, that was one of the pictures when we were driving last summer. Yeah, Barton County, I think.
Caused a wreck.
We did not cause a wreck.
How about drove off the road?
Okay, we've got Jeff Whitworth up next, and Jeff, I've given you co-host duties. Do you want to run your own slideshow, or do you want me to run it from here?
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yep, we got you.
I think maybe I can run it, but maybe not.
Well, you tell me. I'll pull it up if you want me to.
Oh, he set to run it from here.
I'm
It's
okay.
easier to advance.
Okay.
Try again. All right, you should be good.
Are we good? Can you see it? Is it loud enough?
Yeah.
All right. I noticed you put me on last, so I'm assuming I have all the rest of the afternoon.
Yes, 3 o'clock.
All right. Anybody out there? If anybody has any questions, just shout them out. I'll try and do my best to avoid answering them like a good extension personnel will. But otherwise, I'm going to go through this. You can see the topics I've chosen here. These are kind of the ones that we normally have problems with in sorghum. Kind of in that order: chinch bugs, sugarcane, rootstock weevils, grasshoppers, etc. Okay, so if there's not anything that I go through here that you want me to go through, I'm more than happy to do it. Just let me know. So first thing that we encounter every year are chinch bugs. And I might say, first of all, 2019, 2020, relatively insect free for the most part compared to past years. I know some people might argue with that, but really and truly 2019, 2020, in all crops, it was pretty much pretty good year, depending upon your perspective for insects. There just weren't that many. And before I get started, I would like to say anybody that has alfalfa weevils are hatching and are active right now, and they have been for a week or so, especially in south central Kansas. So anyway, chinch bugs, sorghum, corn, grass. Chinch bugs get on any kind of a grass. They can be a problem in fescue. They can be a problem in, any place, lawns, gardens, golf courses. But in sorghum, they can be a real problem. And they historically have been since, I don't know, the 20s or the 30s or for a long time. As a matter of fact, back in the 20s and the 30s, K-State entomologists, now think about this. Back in the 20s and the 30s, think about the transportation they had to use. They went around the state putting out little fungal packets with a fungus that would help control, they thought, or manage chinch bugs and other insects. We still find that around the state today. It's called Bavaria bassiana. We used to say and occasionally it will help manage chinch bug populations for us. It takes warm, humid conditions, and that Bavaria bassiana, that fungus is still around. So we still find it today. But that to me, that's talking about the old entomologist is always, I think it's always neat. But Hessian fly and chinch bugs, they did a lot of work on back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Anyway, up the left-hand corner, you see two mating chinch bugs. Those are the adults. That's from whence it all begins. They mate, and then they lay eggs. And down at the middle slide, you see the little tiny, and they are really tiny little nymphs. The nymphs, when they first hatch out, are red. They get behind the leaf sheath of a sorghum plant or corn plant, or in the soil in wheat, if they're in wheat. And they can feed around the base of the plant, and they can cause lodging. Generally speaking, under hot and dry conditions, they suck the juice out of the plant, so they're just adding stress to the plant. So we have seen a lot of lodging back in 2017, 2018, not so much 19 and 20, and we'll wait and see this year. We got good moisture going into the spring this year, so I'm hoping not. But that's where the chinch bugs are in the wheat. They overwinter in bunch grasses, and then they move out into the wheat. And they've already moved into the wheat. I've already been out checking some wheat fields. And what we're finding, and you find a few adult chinch bugs right now in the wheat. So this is the life cycle of the chinch bug. And it always amazes me, a lot of growers don't understand the life cycle, but it's not that difficult. They overwinter as adults for the most part in bunch grasses or grasses. And anymore, we're finding in no-till, they're able to overwinter in leaf litter or residue in some of the no-till, especially if we don't have as harsh a winters. This past winter, I don't know, I haven't been out to check the survivorship, but in past winters, they will overwinter successfully in places right in the field where you have no-till. But normally they're out in some sort of bunch grass or someplace around the root systems of plant. They move out in the spring, they move into winter wheat. As the wheat starts to green up, they can feed on the wheat. And generally they don't cause a problem in wheat, but they can. I have seen it when we have real dry, late winter, early spring. They can actually, stress wheat so that you'll get some thinning in the wheat, but that's where they are. Then they move out of that wheat. That's why we always say don't plant sorghum adjacent to wheat or corn adjacent to wheat. Sorghum more so because of the timing of when it's planted, because they will move out of the wheat. The nymphs, it's called a walking migration. They move out of that wheat and they will absolutely decimate sorghum and corn, especially under stressful growing conditions that are adjacent to the wheat. And then in the fall, they go into overwintering. Now, I'll show you how they can affect sorghum even in late summer or early fall also. But you can see the various stages here. You can have all different stages of chinch bugs in sorghum and corn in, mid to late May, June, all the rest I'll clear up until they go into overwintering. So chinch bug control, the options, again, avoid planting sorghum next to wheat. If you can't, then timing. Time it. You can go out in the wheat as the wheat just starts to senesce or turn yellow or golden. You can go out and sample in the wheat for chinch bugs. You go out and I just use my foot and mark off 1 square foot. If you find one chinch bug of any kind, adult, nymph, whatever, per square foot in that wheat, don't plant sorghum or corn adjacent to that wheat until it has been harvested. At that point in time, all of the nymphs will have passed away or died, so then you can plant your sorghum or your corn adjacent to that wheat field without worrying about chinch bugs. So it's all a matter of timing. That's what it is with most insecticides and insects. It's about timing. So that's what I say, timing, plant sorghum after wheat harvest. Insecticides, you know what? Seed treatments work, but seed treatments, they're only going to last 10 to 14 days. And a lot of times, if you have a serious infestation in the wheat, as those nymphs boil out of that wheat and start sucking the juice out of those plants, they can overcome the young sorghum or the young corn plants. Now, it will kill them, but remember, they have to suck a little bit of the juice out of that plant in order to get the toxin to control to kill the chinch bugs. So if there's enough of them and the growing conditions are such, that can be a problem. So just keep that in mind when it comes to where you're going to plant. Go out and sample the wheat if you really want to plant adjacent to wheat, and if you got one chinch bug per square foot in the wheat, I'd hold off or plant right away before they move out. So the plants are tall enough to maybe tolerate a little more feeding damage, but chinch bugs. And generally it's early season we think about chinch bugs, but you see here later in the season, chinch bugs can still cause problems with sorghum. You see the plants on the left of each variety were closest to the wheat field. We planted perpendicular to the wheat, so we could try and get a determination on just how much damage the chinch bugs were causing as they came out of the wheat. Now, first of all, we had to spray early on so the plants could survive because there's a healthy infestation in the wheat. So this was later, as you can see here, this infestation, we let it go. And after about heading, the chinch bugs started flying back into this field. And you can see the effect of the plants closer to the wheat versus the ones further away, the same varieties. I'll have some more about that later. So it's not just that walking migration that comes out of the wheat. It's later on that can affect sorghum also. And here's, as you see, this is natural infestation we had at the heading, not early on, but later on. You can see the impact, economic impact of chinch bugs, whether it was chinch bugs treated or not treated, you can see. So again, this is later on. If they come out early enough, they'll just wipe out the stand and you have to replant. So a lot of times you don't think about later on when they're feeding on the head, but chinch bugs will feed on the head just when just around flowering, when those berries are still soft and succulent, and they can suck juice out. That's why it causes some problems, because they're actually removing nutrients from the berries. So they can cause a problem. So you can see here, it's not just early on, it's later on also. Okay, that's chinch bugs. Now, remember, I'm kind of going through the season from early to late into the season. So the next, generally speaking, the next potential problem pests we have, especially in South Central Kansas, in your area, all the way up to about, 70 Highway, I-70 across there, are sugarcane rootstock weevils. Now, I've seen them north of there, but for the most part, around in Sedgwick County, Rice, South Central Kansas is where we see sugarcane rootstock weevils. Lots of times you don't even know what this is, but they're native to Kansas. They can, again, attack any grass, corn and sorghum, the ones mainly concerned. And if we have, again, stressful growing conditions, it's a dry early season, and the rootstock weevil lays eggs in the seedling plants. The larvae hatch out, they crawl inside the plant, and they will feed up and down and around the nodes inside the plant. And actually, I don't know how they do it, but they cause the seedling plant root systems it kind of looks like it's phenoxy herbicide damage. Probably 15, 16 years ago, the first time I saw this, that's what I thought it was. Dallas Peterson and I went on a case down around Great Bend, and it looked like they thought maybe it was herbicide damage, but it turned out to be sugarcane rootstock weevil larvae, and the feeding inside the roots will cause that. Now, if it survives, if you get rain so that the roots attach good enough and you get some good growing conditions, then later on you can have, because of the feeding inside the stalk and the consequent fungus that can get in there, you can have some lodging. So if you have lodging in your sorghum, that, kind of unexplained lodging out there, all of a sudden go out and look, split the stalks, and you might see where there's some tunneling that had occurred earlier on. So that's the sugarcane rootstock weevil. We've had problems with those periodically over the years around the state. The next, grasshoppers. Grasshoppers are our number one, in my opinion, our number one agricultural problem in all crops. They'll feed on soybeans, sorghum. They're non-discriminate. They'll feed on anything that grows. and they can be a real problem. The only thing I like to recommend is you get out and check early, because grasshoppers are easiest to control early on while they're small. When they're in the nymphal stage, the eggs are laid in August, in July, August, September. They're laid in non-disturbed areas, so CRP, grassy areas, weedy areas, and then those eggs hatch into the nymphs and they move out into the crop field. So when you're out checking the borders or you're walking through weedy areas of your field, if you see nymphs, as you see here, 15 to 20 nymphs per square yard in the border areas, you want to treat that area before they move out into the field, of any field, whether it's sorghum, corn, whatever, because they can do a number if there's enough of them. But grasshoppers, in my opinion, are number one problem agriculturally as far as insects go throughout the state and all crops. Then we have the ragworms, the ragged foliar feeding and the sorghum. I get calls about this every year because it does look bad. It does look like that could really reduce yield. The two main insects that cause this problem are the fall armyworm and the corn earworm, but it can be armyworms, it can be just about anything. And they do rag up the plant considerably. This is what they look like. This is the fall armyworm. It doesn't really matter. Either one, they feed inside the whorl. As they take a few bites off that, then that leaf grows out and it looks, it's pretty impactful. It's pretty cause for concern. But we do not recommend treating for ragworms. Ragworms are, they're down inside the whorl. You're not going to get the insecticide down to where they are. These are all contact insecticides. By the time you see the feeding damage, that field I just showed you, by the time that grows out of the whorl, those insects are probably already pupated and gone, so they're not going to do any more feeding anyway. So we really don't recommend treating ragworms during the whorl stage, but I always get calls about it. Now, those same worms, the next generation or 2 generations later, will be headworms. And that's where we do have a problem when they feed on the head. They feed on the kernels or the berries within that head. You got to remember, sorghum is vulnerable to headworm or berry kernel feeding, whatever you want to call it, for about 2 weeks, from flowering to soft dough stage, okay? So, that changes a little bit due to the weather and the variety, but from flowering to soft dough. So you got to get out there and you got to check it early on. Generally, the rule of thumb, you lose 5% yield per worm per head. So if you got 2 worms, you're losing 10%, 3 worms, 15, etc. Now, it matters a little bit what kind it is, because fall armyworms, they're social. They'll feed all together. If it's corn earworm, they're not. They're pretty aggressive, pretty antisocial. They will bite each other or run each other off, but still on a head, there can be 2 or 3 before they run into each other. So just keep that in mind. If you're out looking at the heads, to me, that's really easy to sample. Just bend the heads over, shake them in a bucket, do 10 heads, 20 heads, 4 or 5 different places in the field, count the number of worms. That tells you your infestation level, and you can figure out, 5% loss per worm per head. 2019, we didn't have much. I'm talking statewide. 2020, we didn't have much. 2018, we did. Okay. So as you can see in the left, in the bottom of the bucket here, there's all different sizes. So the large ones have been feeding for a week or 10 days. The small ones just hatched out, and they're going to be feeding. So you can see on the sorghum, you can see the various sizes here. So you want to catch it early on before they've done too much feeding. And like I said, to me, it's easy to sample for. Just shake the head in the bucket and move on. You can do it. You can do it quite quickly. Then there's some other considerations about spraying them because of the aphids. Traditionally in Kansas, historically, we've always had 3 aphids: cornleaf aphids, green bugs, and yellow sugarcane aphid. And since 2014, now we have the sugarcane aphid also. So now we have 4 aphids, at least we have since then every year. Cornleaf aphids, last year we had a lot of cornleaf aphids. I even heard some folks were wanting to treat for them. you know, they build up a lot. It's generally not field wide. We generally don't recommend treating for cornleaf aphids. There can be a lot of them in a plant here or there, or a little spot in the field here or there, and they can produce a lot of honeydew so that they, you know, stick up the plant so that the head has a really hard time extending out. But they're also good food for lady beetles and other beneficials for later on. So cornleaf aphids, yeah, they can be a lot of them out there in a few plants, but I've never seen the point in time when we need to treat for them. Now, the sugarcane aphid, that's our latest aphid pest that we've had on sugarcane. You can see you can go to my fields. This is the last time I looked at it, 2018. Like I said, 2019, 2020, I couldn't find enough populations to even put out an insecticide trial. But my fields are still viable. You can still check the progress of sugarcane aphids. By the way, the latest is the Texas A&M folks have found overwintering sugarcane aphids down in the southern border of Texas. You know, the historical cold front that went all the way through southern Texas and into Mexico, we were hoping would do away with sugarcane aphids, but there's some survived, at least some on Johnson grass so far. Okay, 2018, like I said, the last time I could find populations like this. 2019, 2020, I found populations, but the beneficials would take care of them before they could develop into numbers like you see here. And the easiest way for me to find a population of sugarcane aphids is look for the beneficials, the lady beetles or the syrphid fly, or the, you know, I mean, they're a lot easier to find those. And then look wherever they are, look on the underside of the leaf. That's generally where you'll find the aphid colonies in. And they do produce a lot of honeydew. So if you look at a leaf and it's all slick and shiny with honeydew, look at the leaf right above that. That's where you'll find the sugarcane aphid colonies. This was taken by one of the extension agents, Tom Maxwell. This to me is very dramatic. To show sugarcane aphid damage in 2016, you can see the treated part of the field and the part of the field that was not treated. Caused the stems to weaken and lodge, and that looks like a severe mess. And it was a severe mess, especially to try and harvest. And this is to me, one of the surprising results of a sugarcane aphid infestation also. You can see the fungal infected stalks on the right and the non-fungal infected stalks on the left. And that is caused by the stress of the feeding of the sugarcane aphid and allowing the fungus to take over. And that's what actually caused the lodging on the field you just saw previous, the untreated. So I thought this was really interesting. Judy O'Mara from Plant Path worked with us on this to determine that. And here's the same data from that same field provided by Tom Maxwell. Now, admittedly, this grower, he rigged up a system where he could go really slow and get the heads down on the field to pick up the grain. But still, you can see that that was a very dramatic looking field. If you drove by there, you would consider that a complete loss, or I would. But the grower was innovative enough to go along there and pick up the grain so that there was not that much of a loss. Yeah, there's loss of time and effort, but still, you can see that it was available to be picked up. Now, the other thing I want to say about sugarcane aphids, the problem we always have, are we going to spray a conventional insecticide to control the moths that get in the head moths, right? And that's going to kill all the beneficials. And therefore, it might exacerbate the sugarcane aphid, and that's a serious consideration. But and if you use an insecticide, conventional insecticide, it'll do a pretty good job of controlling the head moths, does a pretty good job of controlling the beneficials. It will kill the aphids, but many of the aphids will be on the underneath side of the leaves, and they will come back a lot faster than the beneficials will. And when we've been out in these fields, we're getting inundated by sugarcane aphids, even clear up till harvest. They're still being blown in on southern winds. So that's one of the problems. So they can come back a lot faster. But still, you got to remember, if you use an insecticide to control head moths, it can affect the beneficials. There are 2 new products that were on the market year before last, virus products, one that was specifically for fall armyworms, one that was specifically for corn earworms, but I didn't hear anything about them in 2020. And the rep followed me all around in 2019, and she was all excited about them, and I wanted to test them, but they would never give me any product to test where we'd have it untreated versus a treated. So there are 2 products that are more specific to aphids that would be gentler on beneficials, but I don't know about the availability for 2021 yet. Now, like I said, if you're losing 5% per worm per head, and you know you got that infestation versus whether you're going to have any sugarcane aphids or not, that's a consideration. So that is a problem. That's what you need to consider. And then sorghum midge. We've had sorghum midge problems historically in Kansas, generally in the southeastern part of the state, although they don't grow much sorghum there. But it has moved a little bit west, a little bit north. So we are seeing, or we have seen, sorghum midge a little further in the state than usual. It's more of an occasional pest, I think, so far. But you can see here, if you have it, you can see the pupal cases that are left from the feeding of the larva inside. The larvae are feeding on the embryo or the developing kernel or the developing berry, whatever you want to call it. This is kind of damage. They cause what you call blasted heads because they're inside the bracts. They're feeding on the developing embryo, and so usually we don't notice it till it's too late. Now, I was in Texas for 4 years, and down around Corpus Christi, they had this problem every year. It's a real problem to sample for just because it's so small, it's hard to detect. And so a lot of times down there where they know they're going to have a problem year after year, they would treat prophylactically. They would treat just as the sorghum started to flower just before in anticipation of it. Up here, we have not seen that problem, and it's really till after the fact that we've noticed we have some bracts. Now, a lot of what we have, the blasted heads, I think is also environmentally caused, not just caused the sorghum midge. And we've looked literally at thousands of heads in 2018. Again, 2019, 2020, we didn't have that big well, I didn't hear about it and I didn't see that big a problem, but in 2018 we did. So we collected thousands of heads and looked for sorghum midge larvae. We could not find very many. So I think a lot of what was attributed to sorghum midge damage was something environmental, and Dr. Sampati, he had it figured out pretty well. He's given some reasons for it also. So anyway, it can be sorghum midge, but I didn't see a lot of it. Also, we have 2 books, Crop Insects of Kansas. We're out. First printing is done. We're waiting for a second edition, and we're going to update that, and hopefully maybe that'll be out sometime in my lifetime, maybe. But Household Pests of Kansas is out also. So there you go. That's my time, I'm hoping. If you have any questions, I'm here for you.
Thank you, Jeff. Are there any questions? Okay. If not, I think that's it for the day. There's a few extra lunches in the back there if you guys want to pick one up on your way out. And those of you who are joining us virtually as well, we will send out the slides that we have available and also the recording from today. So thanks again and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Y'all have a great time. Thank you, Kelsey.
Thanks, Jeff.